Hello, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Jürgen Steinacker, and I see there is no members of the jury here, and even Patrick and others. And even if that's not there, we are at time at the start. I think that's an applause for the audience. So we are setting now the race for this 2.5-day conference. This is not a long word of greetings. I want to say hello to all of you. A lot of friends are here, a lot of rowers, scientists, and interesting people. And the big response to our program is due to the work of the Sports Medicine Commission and the Competitive Commission of FISA, who designed the program which I had the honor to bring into effect. And we are very happy that we have such much response. We have now more than 330 people to this conference. We calculate the beginning is 120, and Matt Swiss said to me, last time it was 80. I don't believe it. Okay, now you are the proof that a good concept, a nice city, the weather is not so fine, but it's good for the conference, will help you, and I hope you wish you the very best. Thank you very much, and I have my co-chair, Catherine Ackermann from Harvard Medical School and Sports Medicine Department. She will share the session. We try to keep on time with all the presentations because we have a huge program. Thank you all for coming. Switching. The first speaker is Professor Carsten Köhler. He's originally German, but he's now since 3 years now. 3 years as I was in Nebraska, in Lincoln, and in the Department of Nutrition and Health Science. And we are happy that he will present a speech on energy deficiency and nutrition in high-performance sports.
All right, thank you very much. I hope the mic works. Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we get the echo? Okay, wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think this. Can we get it to work? We can. Soll ich das hier nehmen? Okay. Sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess it's always difficult with a microphone. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's very exciting to be here in Berlin. Like Dr. Steinacker said, I'm originally German, so if you have any questions from the German audience, I may give those in German as well. Wonderful. Okay, if we, usually my students are kind of at that age where we like, I don't know, does it work? Okay. Where we like memes, so I figured I'd start with a meme as well. I guess your athletes are in a similar age. This is a meme on calories, and I guess we all in sports, we know that expending 2,000 calories is not abnormal. I guess in our age, sitting here all day is more likely to expend or burn 2,000 calories when we just leave the oven on. I will take you. I don't know what. Yeah? Okay. Very sorry for this. This is not how it's supposed to start. Okay, well, anyhow, I have my task today is to convince you about a very very basic thing. Listen to your nutritionist, listen to your dietitian. Don't make fun of them if they're talking about calories or counting calories. There's an important reason to this. So I'll start out with the boring stuff, of course. I will start out with talking a little bit about definitions. And when we talk about energy balance and energy deficiency, what do we actually imply? I'll then transition over to consequences of energy deficiency, both metabolic consequences, but also, I guess, for you, more important are actually performance effects. So I'll highlight those as much as we know. I have an example from the rowing world that I hope will give you a little bit more more weight on that. And at the end, I will briefly talk, if there's enough time, about possible counter strategies to alleviate some of the negative effects that we may see. So starting out, this is a distribution of energy expenditure in the normal population. This is from Klaas Westerterp in the Netherlands, measured energy expenditure measured as the ratio between total energy expenditure over resting metabolic rate, assessed by the gold standard methodology, which is doubly labeled water and indirect calorimetry. We express this, I don't know what's going on here. We express this ratio as a physical activity level, but I've converted that level for you in terms of calories. This is roughly a male, 70 kilograms, 25 years of age, so that may not necessarily apply to your rowers who tend to be heavier, more so maybe the lightweight rowers, but nevertheless, maybe to yourself. So we're talking roughly in the average population. We do have a few people who tend to expend more, but the average is a physical activity level of about 1.6, 1.7, meaning that expenditure is somewhere in the range between 2,500 to 2,800 calories. Now, if we expand this assessment to athletes, the first thing we have to do is we have to extend the range of our x-axis. So if we're looking here, all of a sudden, we have on the right side, we're going up to 6,000 or 7,000 calories. I picked studies, again, using the same methodology, doubly labeled water and direct calorimetry, to really make the results comparable. And you see that, especially if we're talking about endurance athletes, those are the athletes that are expending a lot of energy. We've got examples from swimmers, runners here, but also cross-country skiing, and kind of so far the highest values and sustainable limits reported in Tour de France cyclists. Now, the good news is there is a study on rowing as well. So I found a study from 2002 from Australia looking at energy expenditure in lightweight rowers. So the good news is even if they're lightweight rowers, we normalize over, we adjust this for size of body. So the physical activity level may be fairly well comparable to what we see in heavyweight rowers, even though their true expenditure may be a little bit on the higher side. But roughly we're talking about in the range of 2.8, or translating into calories, 3,800 to 4,000 calories again as a sustained energy expenditure. So obviously these individuals are very different from the normal population, and you'll get in a second hopefully why I emphasize that so much. So what do the recommendations say? The American College of Sports Medicine position stand on nutrition and athletic performance states in 2009 that meeting energy needs is a nutrition priority, and they correctly state that energy balance occurs when energy intake equals expenditure. That's great, but the problem is if I look at athletes, they come in all shapes and forms, and honestly, energy balance is not their objective. They want to win, they want to perform well, and as far as I know, there's no gold medal in being in energy balance. It's really about whatever gets your performance. So it's not really the goal, and again, I hope I can convince you that looking at energy balance itself may not be a great idea. So what is energy balance? Let's define it very quickly. Probably most of you have learned it somewhere in a textbook, physiology, or if you had a nutrition class, great. Energy balance is ultimately the ratio between energy intake and energy expenditure. Energy intake is simple, that's what we eat, that's the calories that we consume. Energy expenditure, on the other side, we have multiple components. So we kind of want to divvy this out a little bit more. On the upper end, we have what we expend during exercise. So obviously that is the biggest chunk that is different from our exercising versus our normal population. We have energy we expend during non-exercise activities, sitting around, thinking, trying not to fall asleep as you do right now. Those things would fall in there. Obviously, that's not a whole lot. And then we have resting metabolic rate, the energy that's needed to maintain basic physiological functions in an awake state. In the normal population, resting metabolic rate is usually the largest component, 60 to 70%. But obviously in exercising or in athletes, that's a different story. Now, again, this is the definition, but I think it doesn't help us much because we do have reasons to believe that energy balance, again, is not really the objective. We have a different state in athletes. Let's start with the intake side. Again, this is not for everyone, but there are cases where energy intake may be reduced to what would be optimal for specific reasons. Usually it's related around body weight, attempts to minimize body weight or maintain a low body weight. So in rowing specifically, we talk about weight limitations in terms of lightweight rowing. Endurance sports, every kg that I have to move around extra will require additional energy and effort. Anti-gravity sports, I guess it makes sense. If I have to jump higher, or if I have to jump, the lighter I am, the higher I'm going to jump with the same effort. And we should never forget about aesthetics, not only in sports that involve aesthetics, but also maybe in athletes who want to appear aesthetically to the audience. So that's something to consider. And I intentionally separated that from disordered eating and clinical eating disorders, which can be associated with these factors, but don't necessarily have to happen. So this is on the intake side. If we look at the expenditure side, obviously what I laid out earlier, we have the increased expenditure during exercise and potentially also slightly increased expenditure due to greater muscle mass. But that's probably not as relevant. So if we put this back into a perspective, if we're talking about the balance, really, there's no balance. There is actually, the balance is out of whack. We have potentially reduced energy intake, increased expenditure, and again, primarily a result of increased exercise expenditure. So we all know, again, this is textbook knowledge. In an energy imbalance, what happens, or in an energy deficit, what happens? Well, we can't create or destroy energy. So the first law of thermodynamics basically tells us it has to go somewhere, it has to come somewhere. So usually that's what we tend to believe. We lose weight, right? That's what everybody tells you. You have to cut your calories or spend more to lose weight. That is correct and it works, but what we tend to forget, biological systems don't only have a tendency to return to an equilibrium. So weight loss is one way to return to an equilibrium, but it's not the only one. There's more to it, and if we want to get back into balance, another possibility is if we can't increase expenditure, well, then we can reduce, if we can't increase intake, well, we can reduce expenditure to a level to bring the balance back to an equilibrium. And this is something I want to talk about more. And you can see this on this image. The relations are a little bit exaggerated, but obviously if I'm training and exercising, I have a defined program. I'm not going to cut on my exercise program necessarily. So the only way to expend less is by actually reduce some of these energy consuming processes to bring us back to a balance. And in that case, if we're back in a balance, we're in a weight stable environment, meaning weight loss does not occur anymore. So why am I saying this? Really because what I said earlier, energy balance is not only the goal, but it's also a terrible goal if you wanted to shoot at it, because it's a moving target. It changes over time, and it changes depending on the state you're in. So this is a study, very well controlled intake, controlled expenditure, and they measured, controlled exercise expenditure, and they measured energy balance in the lab. Over 7 days, you can see that individuals initially started out in a deficit about 1,800 calories, and by day 7, their energy balance actually slowly crept up, just because their resting metabolic rate declined. They were doing the same amount of exercise, and they were consuming the same amount of calories. So if I extrapolate this further, you get the idea. Energy balance slowly returns to an equilibrium, really. So this, if you do the math here, the equation is here. After 20 days, if we extend this trend, the individuals would have been back in an energy balanced state. So again, not a great idea to look for energy balance. So how do we address this if we can't measure energy balance, which is also very difficult to measure? Well, we can look at the individual components, and specifically resting metabolic rate, this compartment that basically describes the basal metabolic needs of our body. So we do this in our lab quite a bit, and obviously we can measure resting metabolic rate. We do this by indirect calorimetry, meaning that we measure oxygen uptake, carbon dioxide production. You wear a nice hood, you look all happy in there. The problem is that value alone doesn't tell us much. It tells us what an individual's resting metabolic rate is, but again, that alone doesn't tell us where they are in their metabolic state, really. But we kind of take a separate avenue, and we combine this actually with knowledge of how much a person would actually expend if they were in a healthy, normal state. So what we do is we use whole body imaging, usually DEXA, to basically dissect our individuals, not really, but just their images, and with that we actually get the size of different metabolic organs. Those organs that contribute to overall whole body resting metabolic rate. So we have our skeletal muscle, we have brain, inner organs, adipose tissue, bone, and some residual mass. And knowing the size of these organs and knowing how much an organ expends in a normal metabolic state, we can actually simulate an individual's resting metabolic rate, and then we can compare the two. And basically say, this is how much you're actually expending, and this is how much you should be expending if you were in a normal metabolic state. And with that ratio, we can actually believe we can make assumptions about the individual's energy state. So in one study, we used female athletes with menstrual disturbances, and this is a very classic model of energy deficiency. It's well established that energy deficiency leads to these disturbances. So on the left side, you will see participants who have basically no menstrual cycle, amenorrhea, over at least 3 months, and we confirmed that actually looking at urinary excretion of metabolites of estrogen and progesterone. You can see this kind of suppressed profile. And then we have a control group that had healthy cycling women, meaning normal increases in estrogen and progesterone throughout the menstrual cycle. And then we measured resting metabolic rate, compared it to the predicted resting metabolic rate, and we see that this is our healthy control group, we see a perfect agreement between the two. 100%, this is what we expected, but in the group that had amenorrhea, we see about a 9% reduction, or roughly 100 calories less being expended than they should expend if they were in a normal state. So this tells us, yes, these individuals are in this mode of energy conservation. They need to expend less energy because they are in a potential prolonged energy deficient state. We're currently analyzing more data. This is preliminary data, but nevertheless, we did a very similar approach in male athletes. This time we picked athletes who are, again, potentially energy deficient. We don't have menstrual cycle as a good marker, but we used athletes from aesthetic sports, specifically ballet dancers, and we used endurance athletes who tend to fall into a similar category as well. We compared them to athletes in sports that are not weight limited or weight restricted, and also sedentary controls. And again, we see that the athletes in those two groups, meaning the ballet dancers and the endurance athletes, on average, their resting metabolic rate is again suppressed by less, only 5%, or about 80 calories per day, but nevertheless, it is persistent, and we don't see that in our control athletes as well as our sedentary controls. So this mechanism obviously shows that, again, we can quantify this degree of energy conservation. How does this energy conversation, how can we actually physiologically explain that? Why are people expending less energy? Well, going back into the literature, there are really good studies from Ann Laux's lab at Ohio University. She did very well controlled studies, basically putting people on a fixed amount of energy expenditure and then altering the caloric intake. She uses an index of energy availability. Dr. Ackerman will talk more about that in a second, so I'm not going to take that away. But nevertheless, she sees, we see here direct relationships between the level of energy availability or the amount of energy deficit and a certain metabolic hormones. For example, leptin is reduced. We know that leptin is an indicator of energy status, so that is not very surprising, but we see a reduction in thyroid hormones, for example. Thyroid hormones, or specifically T3, is involved in resting metabolic rate. It's involved in thermogenesis and other functions. So again, evidence of conserving energy. We see reductions in IGF-1 specifically, IGF-1 being the primary anabolic hormone that acts for growth hormone on skeletal muscle and bone. So we do very rapid reductions there. We also see increases in cortisol, the stress hormone, so increased stress levels, also catabolic in its effects. And we see a reduction in insulin, which also has anabolic properties and is involved for storing muscle glycogen. So if kind of take this together, and this is even a bigger picture, we see the effects of this energy deficient state very broadly on multiple different organs. The adipose tissue, which is actually favorable, we want to reduce that, but we see effects on resting metabolic rate. I did not go into effects on appetite and food intake, but you can imagine if you're in an energy deficient state, your appetite increases, your hunger levels increases, you want to eat more. But what I want to focus on obviously is the effects on the musculoskeletal system and specifically the skeletal muscle. And again, there's evidence for a whole benchmark of hormones being altered. Like I said, cortisol increased, IGF-1 and insulin reduced. We also know that both androgens and estrogens are possibly reduced. And even if you look at the level of the actual muscle, we see a reduction in muscle protein synthesis, increase in muscle protein breakdown. So clearly catabolic situation. We actually see very different, similar things on the bone as well, bone formation being reduced and bone resorption being increased. Now, again, athletes don't care about hormones as much as they care about other things like performance. So again, if we can relay these things back to performance, I think it sends a even stronger message. So as a disclaimer before, there is virtually there's no literature on actually controlled experiments looking on the effects of energy deficiency on performance. However, there's some data of observational studies that have looked at some of these effects. So the first study that I'd like to present is a study von Van Hees in swimmers who underwent a 12-week training program. And retrospectively, they divided the swimmers into two groups. One group, again, were those female swimmers who had menstrual disturbances as an indicator of energy deficiency, and the second group were regularly cycling swimmers. And the groups are actually fairly matched in terms of group size, etc. Now, when they looked at dietary intake, again, retrospectively, dietary energy intake was lower, about 30%. In those female swimmers. They measured metabolic hormones, no surprise, thyroid hormones were reduced, IGF-1 was reduced as well, so this very well mimics what I showed earlier. They did also, and this is the important part, then at the end of that 12-week period, they measured performance by doing a 400-meter time trial. And they looked at 400-meter swim velocity, and you see an increase in the swim velocity in the athletes that were actually menstruating. So we assume they're in an actual balanced state. That's what you would expect from a 12-week training program in young swimmers, right? Now the other group, those were the menstrually disturbed athletes. Their IGF-1 was lower, T3 was lower, and their swim velocity from the beginning to the end of those 12 weeks actually declined. Fairly significantly. If you look here, every single athlete who was in the one group increased, and every single athlete who was in the other group decreased. So this data, I think, is very strong, but again, it's only correlational, not a controlled trial. I said I promised I would also bring an example from the rowing world. So this is a study published last year from Australia. Again, observational in a way that they looked at what happened in 4 weeks of training program in Australian team rowers. So they did a 4-week training program of intensified training, meaning that their training volume increased about 20 to 50%. They also assess dietary intake, and this is once before and once at the end of this or after this 4-week training program. So by increasing training volume by 20 to 50%, you would expect that there's some form of compensation, they eat more. That was not the case. You can virtually see their energy intake was the same and their macronutrient distribution was very much the same as well. So again, we can already assume there's a mismatch between the two. They're spending more, but they're not eating more, meaning they have to be in a deficient state. That is definitely supported by changes in body weight. They lost weight. They specifically lost fat mass. They did not lose actual lean mass, which in itself is good. But they also measured resting metabolic rate, and that's kind of what I showed earlier. They saw a reduction in resting metabolic rate by about 110 calories, which may not sound like a lot, but again, it's evidence of this metabolic conservation that we see. Again, most importantly, they also measured time trial performance. This was a 5-kilometer time trial. You may be actually much more familiar with that than I am. But the important part of this study is once they looked at performance declined at the end of this 4-week training period, and more specifically, especially in the later parts of that 5-kilometer time trial. Basically, their pacing was terrible. They started out actually faster, but then in the end completely bunked and actually performed less well overall. So again, I hope this data shows that we can connect the dots between those metabolic adaptations, energy state, and also performance. At last, I would like to talk a little bit about what can we do against it. Now, the obvious thing is don't get in an energy deficient state, which may be difficult at times, which actually may be impossible if you actually want to reduce weight, you lose weight. But we think we should do it strategically. We should do it at certain times, but also there's things that we can do to maximize the benefit. So in our lab, we look a lot at how can we manipulate exercise and diet to make weight loss very specific to the weight that we want to lose, which is fat mass. And going back to the kind of the weight loss literature, and there's a lot of weight loss literature out there, we know that we can, by modulating exercise and increasing protein intake, for example, we can shift that weight loss away from lean mass. We never want to lose lean mass, specifically because it's muscle mass, most likely that's lost, to complete fat mass. And in the best case, actually would like to gain lean mass while losing fat mass. That's kind of the ideal scenario. So our hypothesis is that through exercise and high protein intake, we can do that. How we do this, usually we do short-term interventions because we can control it well. We feed people everything for 4 to 5 days. We control their exercise. We collect blood. We measure body composition, and then we can do functional tests at the beginning, at the end, whether endurance tests or strength tests, these kind of things. The first study, we looked at simple exercising versus non-exercising, meaning 4 days or 5 days of not exercising, which is really hard for trained individuals to do, compared that with exercising every single day. And the important part is we match their energy deficit, which is important. And we see that weight loss occurs very similarly, but we see a better retention of fat-free mass or lean mass. We specifically see that retention of fat-free mass in the legs, which is not surprising. Our athletes cycled, so we put them on a bike ergometer, and just the exercise preserved that lean mass in the legs, whereas the changes in fat mass didn't really matter whether they were exercising or whether they were not exercising. We did functional tests as well. We did not see any changes. Now, this is a short-term trial, but still we did not see any changes in strength for our leg muscles. We did a bench press as well, and we actually saw in the group that exercised and was in a deficit, we saw a reduction in bench press. But again, they did cycling and not any upper body exercise, so this is not completely surprising. In the second study, we look at, or currently looking at, the effects of a high protein intake in addition to this exercise. So again, we have 3 groups this time. We have restricted with a low protein intake, which is about the RDA, and then we have a higher protein intake. And again, weight loss is very similar, but the composition of weight loss is vastly different. We're losing a lot less lean mass if we feed a high protein intake. That is not surprising. That's been shown before, but nevertheless, it is important to show. We see greater increases in fat oxidation, again, as additional evidence metabolically. Yes, they're burning more fat, which is a good thing. And we also see favorable changes in certain metabolic hormones, specifically IGF-1. Here on the left, we see a lesser reduction in IGF-1 in the high protein intake, and that's something that has potential to, again, explain why lean mass is preserved and potentially also effects on bone that Dr. Ackerman probably will talk about more. So this data is somewhat promising. So in summary, I would like to start off with an update of this statement on the athletic, or the position stand on athletic performance by ACSM. They've updated it intentionally, kind of started with the older one. The new statement states that an appropriate energy intake, not an intake that matches the need. This is important. It's the cornerstone of an athlete's diet, and it's important for optimal bodily function. So it explains a lot better what the connection between energy and actual body function is. We're not necessarily trying to achieve energy balance at all times. I hope I did convince you that it's important, if you have a team nutritionist or a team dietitian, to listen to them. If you don't, then get one. If you are a nutrition or dietist, then I hope I gave you additional ammunition to shoot back. Body weight, I also hope to convince you that body weight is not a great indicator of energy status at all. Specifically, the fact that we can be in a presumable energy deficit, but because of these metabolic adaptations, we're not experiencing actual weight loss anymore. That these non-vital functions, and specifically growth, something that is suppressed, and anabolic processes are part of that. So again, if you want to reap the benefits of training, this is probably not a good idea. And I hope that I convinced you also that it's not just a metabolism, but there's actual relationships with performance as well, as we showed these 2 examples of performance decrements that I showed. And like I said, we hope to develop more counter strategies, acknowledging that there may be situations when you are in an energy deficit, but again, by maximizing the outcome of those, by incorporating exercise that protects lean mass, and by increasing protein intake, for example, that's a good thing. All right, with that, I would like to thank the people who actually do the work. I just get to present it. My students, PhD students, as well as lab managers. Most importantly, I'd like to thank some collaborators. These are here, the ones that are involved in some of the projects, funding agencies, of course. Without those, work would not be possible. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Carlson. We try to have the discussion together because that's not your fault. That was a microphone, but we try to keep on time. And I'm very happy that we have the next guest speaker, Catherine Ackerman from Massachusetts General Hospital. She is leading the sports endocrine lab there in the endocrine unit, and also is in the sports medicine chair there. So, Kate.
Thank you.
She's talking about energy deficiency in rowers. So, getting more specific.
Oops, these are yours still. Can we get the next talk up here? Or I could just talk about your talk. So I am also from America, and while I'm killing time here, I also have origins in Germany, but please don't ask me any questions in German because we came over about 400 years ago from Germany to the US, so I know about 10 words. Is this my talk? Nope. Any questions for Dr. Kohler while we're waiting? Nope, too bad. Okay, so we're going to now move on to REDS. I really want to thank Dr. Kohler for kind of prepping this, though, because we have a lot of the same topics that we're going to be discussing. Dr. Steinecker usually gets mad at me because I talk quickly, so hopefully I can go through a couple slides and then he won't yell at me because I'm just going to skip over them. So a few disclosures. I'm a member of the Female Athlete Triad Coalition, but also a member of the IOC's REDS Committee and Female Athlete Working Groups, and I'm an endocrine consultant for the Fees and Medical Commission. Our objectives are really to understand this term and the origins of REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, to explain current evidence of the various aspects of REDS, with a focus on rowers. So as much data as I could find, basically focusing on our favorite population, rowers, and then describe some of the future directions for REDS. There is a lot of science and a lot of data in this talk. I know some people are coaches, so forgive me if it gets a little nerdy. The take-home point, if you forget nothing else, is just what Dr. Kohler was saying, which is that we need to appropriately fuel our athletes and look out for REDS. So most of you have heard of the female athlete triad. This was a term that was coined in the early 1990s by the American College of Sports Medicine. They saw this correlation between disordered eating and amenorrhea, loss of menstrual cycles, and then osteoporosis. And this is some of the stuff that Dr. Kohler was discussing. They came up with a position statement in 1997 to talk about that, and then updated that position statement in 2007 and said, really, a lot of our athletes are on these continuums. So you might have somebody who's a great athlete, who's really fueling well, they're up in that top right corner, they have optimal energy availability, they get their menstrual cycle every month, and they actually have better bone health than a non-athlete. So weight-bearing athletes should have better bone density than somebody who's not doing exercise. But a lot of our athletes fall somewhere in the middle before they get to that really bad corner on the left. And the one in the left, they changed the terminology a little bit and said it's really this concept of energy availability, which Dr. Kohler discussed. And it could be with or without an eating disorder. People could have functional hypothalamic amenorrhea, because now we know more about the signaling that starts in the brain up at the hypothalamus that causes all this hormonal suppression when there's not enough caloric intake or caloric balance, and then could have low bone density. But a lot of our athletes fall in the middle. They might have some disordered eating, slight energy deficit, a few more bone stress injuries, not full-on osteoporosis. So we really want to keep all our athletes from going into that left corner. So in 2014, the Female Athlete Triad Coalition came up with an updated statement and talked about different ways to screen for this issue. But the International Olympic Committee also came up with a consensus statement that same year. And they said energy availability in the female athlete triad is really, really important. But we have to remember this can happen to men too. So obviously they don't get menstrual cycles, but they can have energy deficits and they can have hormonal changes. And there can also be performance consequences and other health consequences because of this energy deficiency. So this updated statement came out in 2014. And then I was lucky to join the group, and we updated this position statement with even more proof of this concept in 2018. You don't need to take pictures of the slides. I'm happy to share them with the entire group later if you'd like. So just to go around these two models that the IOC came up with, there was a health consequence wheel and a performance consequence wheel. So if we start up in the corner, you can see the triad is still part of this REDS concept. You get this menstrual function, bone health, and relative energy deficiency connection. But then as you go around, there are other endocrine effects, other metabolic effects, hematologic effects, effects on growth and development, psychological aspects. So we know that psychological issues can affect relative energy deficiency and energy intake, but also energy deficiency can have effects on the psyche of an athlete. There are cardiovascular consequences, GI issues, and immunologic issues. So on the performance side, these were the other things that they proposed and said there may be potential performance effects. And to Dr. Kohler's point, we don't have as much data about those performance effects. I think those of us who are coaches or clinicians have certainly seen athletes who are not fueling well enough, and we've seen the fall off in terms of performance. But our job as scientists is really to help try to support all these different wheels and find more of the data to prove it to our athletes and to their entourage. So in the next amount of time that I have, I'm going to go around these two wheels and show you what data is available. So Dr. Kohler already talked about what energy availability is and the studies that was based on with Dr. Laux. And overall, what she found in her very controlled studies was that there's a magic number, this number 30. So an energy availability of 30, where energy intake minus exercise energy expenditure normalized to fat-free mass, if that was at least 30, athletes did pretty well. That was based on a couple studies that she did in women that weren't really high-level athletes. So I think we have to really respect that number, but realize that individuals are different, and there might be an even higher energy availability that we need for young people or other athletes. So in general, people have their own sweet spot, but that's kind of a starting point. So just talking about triad and talking about the bone aspect, initially people thought that it was if you had low energy availability, that led to a decrease in estrogen, and that was solely responsible for the low bone density. But now we know that it's much more than that. Yes, there is this disruption of the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, but many things happen when there's not enough energy. And so this is just a slide that shows many, many things that have effects on bone, and things that are very strong predictors of bone and have a good positive correlation with bone are highlighted in green. Things that have a negative correlation with bone are highlighted in red, but all of these things are associated with bone density and bone health. And all of these things are disrupted during states of low energy availability. And in fact, in some of Dr. Laux' studies, even just in the first few days, 5 days of an energy deficiency, before estrogen levels were noted to be off, some of these other hormones specifically related to bone and bone synthesis were already getting disrupted. So we did a study a bunch of years ago looking at 51 runners, 66 rowers, and we found that there were definitely higher rates of menstrual dysfunction in the lightweight rowers, which wasn't that surprising, but it was even higher than some of our distance runners and definitely higher than our open weight rowers. The American College of Sports Medicine considers a Z-score on the DEXA, which compares their bone density to people of their own age group and their own sex. They consider a score less than -1 concerning. And so we just broke it down and said, okay, what was happening with the runners, what was happening with the open weights, and what was happening with the light weights? And we found that the Z-score less than -1 was about 33% in the runners, and that was mostly at the spine, which is a bone that is very trabecular and very affected by a lack of estrogen. In the open weight rowers, they had pretty good bone density, so only 6.5% of them had a bone density below -1. And then in the lightweight rowers, they were similar to the runners. And here, there was a little bit different. So they did have some lower bone density, but their spine was slightly more protected. And the idea is we're doing all this weight bearing against our spine, which runners aren't doing. They're not doing as much strength training at the spine, so that might be a good thing about our sport. Another study that was done looking at 29 female lightweight rowers, so 12 active and 9 retired, were surveyed and also had DEXAs. And they found that the rowers with disordered eating started rowing at a younger age than those without disordered eating, and their amount of intentional weight loss was associated with a poor score on an eating disorder questionnaire, the EAT 26. So these are people that start training earlier, and we know just in the sports medicine literature with kids who are getting sport specific earlier on, they tend to struggle more with eating disorders at a higher rate. 76% of these lightweights had a history of oligomenorrhea, so menstrual irregularity, or amenorrhea, no period at all, and 32% of them had rib pain, and we know that rib pain is typically due to a bone stress injury. 41% had low bone mineral density, 3 at the spine, 1 at the femoral neck, part of that hip, and 8 at the radius. And what they also did was they correlated the bone mineral density with the menstrual dysfunction. And you can see that the lumbar spine was significantly higher, that's that second column, in those who had normal menstrual cycles versus those who did not. They also correlated the menstrual cycle or the bone density with the rib pain. And you can see that the total body and the lumbar spine bone density was better in those who did not experience rib stress fractures or rib injuries. What about in lightweight men? So there was a study with the Danish team, 13 Danish team lightweight male rowers. They found that their bone mineral density was within normal range, which is great. However, they also found that their testosterone correlated with their bone density. So on the top one, that's a correlation of 0.63, and they found that the lumbar spine increased as the testosterone level was higher. The lower picture demonstrates that the lumbar spine correlated with the number of years that they were training as well. So again, there is some osteogenic benefit from rowing that's happening on the spine, like we showed in our women's study. But overall, the sparse data that is out there on lightweight men demonstrates that lightweight male rowers have slightly lower testosterone, lower bone mineral density, and an increased risk for rib stress fracture compared to open weight men. This is some preliminary data that was provided by Bronwyn Lundy. Dr. Kohler mentioned Bronwyn as well, and I think Bronwyn's somewhere in the audience. She's been doing some great work with the Australian team. And so she actually looked at open weight men and followed their bone density. So had DEXAs at different time over a course of somewhere between 2 and 4.5 years, depending on which athletes they were. And this was pretty impressive. So we think of this as being a lightweight problem, this energy availability issue, but these were open weight men who were training a lot, had full access to food, but they had a decrease. 10 of those 12 people had a decrease in their lumbar spine, 1.3 to 11.9%, depending on the athlete. 2 of them had increases in the spine, but only 0.1 to 0.6%, and those 2 people still had a decrease at the hip. So they had a 5 and an 8.2% decrease at the hip. So this energy availability issue is real, even in our big, strong, robust, male heavyweight athletes. In the open weight women, it wasn't as clear, so they didn't find these same results. Again, there were only 6 open weights. Bronwyn's doing more of this work, and maybe we'll see more of a pattern in the women. So that kind of talks about the bone aspect. Let's focus on a different aspect in terms of endocrine. So we did a review earlier this year that talked about all of the different endocrine changes that are in the literature in women and in men. Some of these studies were better than others, but we just wanted to get a big comprehensive picture. In general, we found that women who are energy deficient, when they control for removing people that have polycystic ovarian syndrome, which can cause them to have higher androgen levels, in general, women had a normal level of testosterone or it was decreased. That one arrow that was up, those patients probably, there were some PCOS patients in the group. In terms of the men, when they had some energy challenges, they either had normal testosterone or it was decreased. When we talk about hormones that measure energy homeostasis, so as Dr. Kohler mentioned, the resting metabolic rate goes down in both men and women. Leptin goes down. This is important for appetite. It's also important for hormonal signaling. That goes down in both sexes. When we talk about other appetite-regulating hormones, oxytocin and insulin also decrease in both populations. And then over at the thyroid axis, this is something we're starting to look at more and more in our athletes, and it's something that we can test. So in general, T3 is not usually as great of a lab as TSH, but it is a little bit more sensitive. And so we find that people that are very energy depressed will start to show a decrease in their thyroid hormone, a decrease in T3. So I'm just going to focus on the studies that have been done in thyroid. There was a study of 32 subjects, and that was just cross-sectional. They looked at amenorrheic athletes, eumenorrheic athletes, and healthy controls. And the amenorrheic athletes had lower T4 and T3. In another study, same type, amenorrheic athletes, eumenorrheic athletes, and healthy controls, TSH response was actually blunted in the amenorrheic athletes. So when you give thyroid-releasing hormone, that should really give a nice, robust response in TSH, and it was suppressed in those amenorrheic athletes. Another study actually tried to figure out where the energy availability cutoff was. So this was 27 eumenorrheic non-athletes, but they manipulated their energy availability. So they were normal women who had menstrual cycles but were not athletes, and they found that at an energy availability between 19 and 25, there was a decrease in T3 and free T3, and when they went even lower, an energy availability of 10.8 to 19, there was actually an increase in T4 and a different type of T3, which is called reverse T3. So we don't really need reverse T3, we want T3, so there was an increase in that one that is not a helpful thyroid hormone. What about in rowers? So there was a study of 17 collegiate female rowers. They did labs at baseline and then during 20 weeks of their training season. 10 of them had decreases in free T3, and the researchers called those the responders. 7 really weren't affected, but then they just honed in on those responders. And in those responders, free T3 concentrations decreased from baseline during a very intense period of training at week 5 by about 28.2%. and at 10 weeks by 24.9%. And then towards the end of their season, they returned back to baseline. There were similar changes in the patterns that we talked about earlier in terms of leptin and TSH. Another study, 6 male rowers done also here in Germany, was a high-intensity resistance training for 3 weeks, and leptin, TSH, and free T3 dropped during that resistance training. At endurance training for 3 weeks caused TSH to go up, and the authors discussed and said the depression of leptin and the hypothalamic thyroid axis associated with training intensity. So they noticed these changes the more intense the training was for the athletes. What about metabolic rate? Well, we've already talked about the RMR, the resting metabolic rate. There's been a small study of normal weight women who had different exercise and caloric intake alterations for 3 months. And they either had severe energy restrictions, so they were forced to have 1,000 fewer calories a day than typically. They were either moderately restricted or didn't have a restriction. They were in a balanced state. And the weight loss occurred in the severe and the moderately restricted, but less than predicted, suggesting that their RMR probably was manipulated, like Dr. Kohler had suggested. So their RMR slowed down. They should have lost more weight according to the prediction. The RMR decreased by only about 6% in the moderate group, but it was enough to explain some of that weight change. And then in the severe group, the RMR didn't change for everybody, but for those whose RMR did decrease, they lost more weight. And they had a higher RMR to begin with. So if they were in part of that population that already had a slightly suppressed RMR and were forced to then eat 1,000 fewer calories every day, they didn't have quite as much of a change because they were just kind of holding on to what they had. In general, the expected changes in leptin, T3, IGF-1, and ghrelin occurred in the severely restricted. And the energy deficit and adaptive changes in the RMR explain 54% of the weight loss. So we know that there is definitely manipulation of the metabolic rate when there's different access to food. What about in rowers? So back to the Aussies. So this is the study Dr. Kohler was mentioning. They did 4 weeks of training. Their training load went up by 21%, but even though they had access to food, they were training so much they didn't realize they needed to be eating a lot more. They were training, they were sleeping, they weren't getting the food in that they should. And as he mentioned, the RMR went down and the relative RMR went down. Hematologically, so that's another one of the circles, and there was a review paper that talked about this. Many athletes, including rowers with reduced energy availability, also have iron deficiency. I like to use this as a little clinical trick because a lot of my endurance athletes really want to know about their ferritin. So I can kind of get them in the door with the nutritionist if I check their ferritin and say, oh, well, you should probably just talk to the nutritionist about that. Iron deficiency can actually worsen the hypometabolic state associated with decreased energy availability. So iron's actually important for T4 synthesis and to convert T4 to T3, which is the more active form of thyroid hormone. It can also promote energy deficiency. So iron deficiency shifts ATP production from oxidative phosphorylation to anaerobic pathways, which are much more inefficient. Iron is needed for reproductive function, for follicular development, and corpus luteum function. And we also think there's some preliminary studies and some old studies from Israel and the Army that bone health may be further impaired by iron deficiency as well. In terms of growth and development, we don't have a lot of data on rowers, but I think we've all seen very small gymnasts who have had their growth stunted. I certainly in clinic have seen dancers who are training and want to become part of the Boston Ballet 10 years later, and they really start to peter out on their growth curve, so they're just kind of stagnant and falling off their growth curve because they're very energy restricted. This is actually the growth points of one of my patients who had a severe eating disorder and was a dancer, and you can see how she gets right back on her growth curve. The first one is her stature, her height, and the next one below is her weight. Once we fueled her better, you can see she started to grow again. I think as we get our athletes rowing younger and younger, we're going to have questions about if this affects their growth if they're not fueling enough. And something that I learned a lot working with the IOC Reds group was also food insecurity. So if people are coming from countries where they don't have a lot of access to food, or they're getting sponsored but their family isn't getting the same kind of financial support that they are, sometimes there's food guilt about getting enough calories in. So we have to keep our eye out for that. In terms of the psychological aspects, just a couple examples here. So drive for thinness was assessed in exercising and sedentary women using something called the Eating Disorder Inventory. And athletes with a high drive for thinness versus the athletes and the non-athletes who had normal drive for thinness actually scored higher on questions regarding bulimia, ineffectiveness, and cognitive restraint. They experienced more oligo and amenorrhea than the other two groups. They had lower resting energy expenditure and actual resting energy expenditure over predicted resting energy expenditure, and more were classified as energy deficient. They had lower T3 and higher ghrelin. And there was a significant negative correlation between drive for thinness and total T3, adjusted resting energy expenditure, and there was a positive correlation between drive for thinness and ghrelin, one of those appetite regulating hormones. So in adult lightweight male rowers, there is a study that demonstrates high levels of cognitive control of eating are accompanied with body dissatisfaction under hunger but not satiety. So what does that mean? Basically, you have lightweight men who are trying to cut weight. They have extreme levels of cognitive control. They're able to really be disciplined about their food, but the more that they are hungry and really being disciplined, the more body dissatisfaction they have. So the more stressed they are about their body image itself. When they're not hungry and they're satiated, they actually feel better. So let's talk about the cardiovascular system. We have to take a couple leaps to make sense out of this. But in postmenopausal women, there's a decreased level of endogenous estrogen, as we know, and this actually leads to unfavorable lipid profiles and vascular function, so vasodilation. In premenopausal women with anorexia nervosa and athletes with amenorrhea, they also don't have great lipid profiles. Theories include interactions of estrogen deficiency, liver dysfunction, dehydration, reduced cholesterol turnover, a decrease in T3, and delayed cholesterol metabolism. And then retrospective data suggests development of early coronary artery disease in some of the older premenopausal women with a history of functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. So you've got a woman who's maybe 50, not quite postmenopausal yet, but she used to have functional hypothalamic amenorrhea. She used to have many missed cycles. Those type of people seem to be getting earlier coronary artery disease. So another interesting thing about estrogen is that it stimulates the vascular endothelium. So it stimulates the blood vessels, leading to increased nitric oxide, which leads to vasodilation, which is what we want to have at the muscles so that they're getting the blood flow as they're exercising. Nitric oxide also has anti-atherosclerotic properties. So it inhibits platelet aggregation, it affects smooth muscle proliferation, leukocyte adhesion, and LDL oxidation. So it has a positive effect on clots and trying to keep clots from happening, or negative plaques. It has a negative effect on plaque development. Estrogen and regular aerobic exercise are independently associated with enhanced synthesis and bioavailability of this nitric oxide. So estrogen and exercise are good for that. There's a way to measure some of this endothelial function, and that's done with something called flow-mediated dilation. It can assess what's happening at the brachial artery to see what's happening in terms of dilation of those vessels in the arm. And it turns out there's a 95 positive predictive value of abnormal measurement of that brachial artery dilation and what's actually happening in the coronary arteries. So we can use this external measurement at a distal vessel and make some predictions about what's actually happening at the heart. And there have been some studies that were done in the Midwest by Ann Hoke looking at functional or flow-mediated dilation in amenorrheic athletes versus oligomenorrheic athletes and eumenorrheic athletes. And serum estrogen levels positively were correlated with that vascular function. And when vascular function improved, it seemed to correlate with an increase in estrogen. So as these amenorrheic athletes got their periods back, had an increase in estrogen, they actually had better vascular function. So this is another maybe performance effect that we could be emphasizing with our athletes. What about the GI system? So in a systematic review of 123 articles of patients with anorexia nervosa, these people have delayed gastric emptying, increased intestinal transit time, and constipation. They also tend to have increased liver enzymes. We did a study because I was interested in looking at all of these different circles and seeing if we could find more of these correlations to kind of prove this Red's point a little bit more. So we did a survey of 1,000 female sports medicine patients. They were ages 15 to 30. They were defined as athletes if they participated in 4 hours a week of exercise and were on some sort of sports team. And we used surrogate markers for low energy availability. So basically, we asked them, they had self-report for disordered eating or eating disorder. They had to answer the beta-Q, which is an eating disorder questionnaire for athletes. And then they also had to answer the eating disorder screen for primary care. If they had a positive answer on any of those, we use that as a surrogate for low energy availability. And there's a Venn diagram of how someone may not self-report, but they could have a very high score on a beta-Q or on the ESP. We had an 85% response rate, and what we found was that there was low energy availability in almost half our patients. These are all comers, these are all athletes from different sports, but it just shows how many of them are struggling with this issue, and it was really eye-opening for me, even though this is an area that I work in every day. And in those people who had low energy availability, they had a 1.5 greater odds of GI complaints than the ones who had adequate energy intake. So they also were getting some of these GI complaints, which is why I think it's really important as physicians to not be practicing in a silo. If I'm seeing an athlete for a stress fracture and I'm ignoring the fact that she's also been going to GI because of delayed gastric emptying or constipation, I might be missing the bigger picture about energy availability, tying it together. What about immune function? So athletes with higher training loads often experience impaired immune function, and they also get frequent upper respiratory infections. And it turns out that salivary IgA correlates with increased upper respiratory infections. Salivary IgA also correlates with estradiol. So a group in Japan actually studied 21 Japanese elite collegiate runners. 13 of them were amenorrheic and 8 were eumenorrheic. And they looked at salivary IgA levels, serum estradiol levels, and progesterone, and the number of upper respiratory infections that they had had just in the last month. And it turned out the amenorrheic athletes had lower levels of serum estradiol, which isn't surprising because they were amenorrheic, and they had lower levels of IgA secretion, and they had more upper respiratory infections. Back to the Aussies, they did a study looking at their athletes who were prepping for Rio, and they used something called the LEAF-Q, which is a great survey that's used for low energy availability screening in women. They're also now developing with an international cohort a LEAM-Q, which can measure this and do questions for males to also test for this. But in the women, they found that the low EA athletes had an increased odds of illness, so upper respiratory infections, GI tract issues, body aches, and head-related symptoms in the prior month. So there are ways that we should be screening our athletes to make sure that they're staying healthy and that they're fueling enough. So to touch briefly just on the performance effects, as Dr. Kohler said, we need more data in this area, but we've seen some case studies and we've seen some small studies that say, absolutely, there's an increase of injury risk, there's a decreased training response, there's impaired judgment, decreased concentration, irritability, depression, decreased glycogen stores, decreased muscle strength. So we'll talk about a few of the studies that relate to that. So we looked at amenorrheic athletes, eumenorrheic athletes, and healthy controls and asked them about their stress fracture history. And the amenorrheic athletes are in the black bars, and the eumenorrheic athletes are in those little white bars. And this was lifetime stress fracture history in people that were 15 to 25, but they gave us all of their old stories about their injuries. Notice there are no non-athletes on this slide because they're not doing anything repetitive, so we're not going to find anything about stress fracture in someone who's not doing a lot of repetitive weight bearing. At the ages of 13, 15, 16, this is during adolescence when women are having a growth spurt and their bones are growing quickly, but they're not filling in as rapidly as they are getting longer. There were a few more stress fractures. But in the amenorrheic athletes, you can see as they stayed amenorrheic, their stress fracture rate went up and up and up. So there's absolutely a correlation there with injury risk. We talked about this rower study earlier. Dr. Kohler stole my thunder. This is amazing. These are the elite athletes on the Australian team, and they're training like crazy and doing everything right, except not fueling, and they got slower. So that's not good. We have to make sure that we're getting these people to fuel while they're doing all this extra training. What about muscle strength? So there was a study looking at neuromuscular performance in elite amenorrheic athletes. 2 more slides. And the knee muscle strength and knee muscular endurance was worse in the amenorrheic athletes, and reaction time was longer. The fat-free mass went down, glucose went down, estrogen went down, T3 and cortisol all correlated with those findings. We talked about the junior swimmers. They also got slower. So what do we need to know about rowers and REDs? There's an increased risk for low energy availability resulting health consequences with REDs. We know that athletes, especially our lightweights, are often doing cyclical changes in body mass and composition to make weight, and this can be detrimental. We know that prolonged inadequate energy intake to meet high exercise energy expenditure can be an issue. There can be abrupt changes in training volume and intensity that need to be matched in terms of food. And participation in strenuous endurance events without change in nutrition is going to increase the risk as well. Inadequate food availability, including food insecurity from cultural practices or lack of financial resources, are important for us to be aware of. And the medical profession can often spot this, but we really have to be convincing our athletes and convincing our coaches and the other people that work with them. So that top picture is a picture of a female DEXA, and the bottom one is a male DEXA. Yellow is fat. Neither one of them has fat on them, and neither one of them is functioning properly, and they have very suppressed hormones. So I like to figure out whatever signs we can use that might help our athletes realize this. Amenorrhea for female athletes, decreased libido or low testosterone in males, low white blood cell count, low iron, low T3, low vitamin D, abnormal liver function, altered lipids, decreased performance, decreased bone density, low BMI, and finally low fat mass. And performance is the big thing that they're really going to hone in on. This is the REDS CAT, the IOC screening tool, and in the future we need more studies in rowers. We absolutely need to be tracking energy availability and prioritizing fueling and determine these return to play protocols. When do we need to pull an athlete out and when can we put them back into participation? We need some more hormonal therapies to maybe help while they're buying into the energy repletion, and we need more awareness and more prevention programs. So clearly we also need more collaboration with the Aussies because they're doing some great work. So thank you to Brownwin and her group for doing all the great work. And others who want to join us in our international collaborations. Thank you. These are my funding sources, and happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. I have to complain that I'm guilty because I invited such good, excellent speakers, and I know they present so much knowledge in a very rapid time. I think next time I apologize if we go to 45 minutes. But you will present another 40 slides in this. Okay, so we try. We have no time for questions at this time because we want to cope up, and if my presentation is a little bit going in the same direction. Rowing is maximum. Why we do such a lecture? As I started in sports medicine as a rower, and we did such, like today, we do 2,000-meter tests and on the arc, and then we started as a rower to get all the multi-stage tests. You see here this very old guessing ergometer test with oxygen consumption. And we were able then to make lactate curves and to follow the oxygen consumption over time in rowers. This is the beginning of the question, what is a perfect way of rowing? And with the rowing ergometer, concept 2, we had a better tool, we had more ergometers available. The guessing was really costly and very difficult to transport. And with this, we tried to develop a model which is to explain performance of sport athletes. And this is strength, endurance. Rowing is a strength endurance sport that generates power and propulsion, and we have internal and external efficiency to deal with. This is the model which we're telling and teaching. Rowing is a strength endurance sport. I think this model, and then we have also the measurements for this. And you see here, it starts with VO2 as a measure of endurance, and you see, that's not clearly endurance. And why rowers don't even have the most force and most endurance, don't compete excellent, and what is the problem? And the issues of this talk is, does the term rowing as a strength endurance sport limit our perspective? Is it for internal communication, because it limits our training schedule, strategies, development of rowers, and the external communication? Let's say we were not able to communicate to the IOC president that why we need 2,000 meters and why we need lightweight rowing. He did not accept it because we're communicating as a strength endurance sport, and he said, why you don't do 2,000 meters for this? The race profile of rowing is well known, and that's very old data from GDR. We are in the old GDR area. That's the most famous hotel of the GDR here. And you see start strokes, the first 10 seconds, high stroke rate, high power. We have then the start goes further to 60 seconds, then the race, and then the end spurt. That's very clear. We have high power, high strength, and you see here is the high power. No? The strength values and the endurance, yes, 6 minutes. And there are old data which were measured just in the area of Hochschönhausen. That's muscle biopsy data published from Roth and Wolf and Hazard and Pansold. Muscle biopsy data on rowing ergometer exercise. You see here the metabolic contribution of such a rowing race, and you see here the anaerobic lactacid and the aerobic part, and you see in the second part of the race it's mainly aerobic. How to analyze this? We had we made one experiment to differentiate rowers by the 100-meter start time, where we have the highest power output and the highest strength. The problem is you cannot measure VO2 or muscle biopsies during a race. So we did this in a World Cup in Munich, and then we looked at the 100-meter time, and you see that in this World Cup, 50% of the winners of the first 100 meter were the finished at gold, but it was not true for a world championship. But it is a prediction, a really good prediction of the 100-meter time, but the 100-meter time is very difficult to measure because you need really hundreds of seconds, and it's difficult to get access to the timing system. So, but that imposes something which is maximum. Oops. Strength is quite clear. Training has an impact on muscles, and we know that muscles have different fiber types: slow type 1, type 2A or fast oxidative, and type 2 fast muscles. And when we look, I just switched through it to make it not so long. Then you see the muscle type, and when we look at rowers, we have data from rowers, that's GDR data. You see the type 1 is 70% about, and the type 2A is 29%. That was in 1979. There are similar data from Larsen Forberg from Scandinavia, and there are also biopsy data 10 years later from our group. And you see that the type 1 type is very high, and the juniors is not as high. And we have found all our researchers did not found any fast type fibers. That means, for me, it was always something. We have a sport who needs so much power to accelerate the boat, and we have no fast fibers found in these athletes. And it starts from the juniors have lower type 1, and we teaching them to have high type 1 fibers. And with going to more fast, slow type fibers, the GDR has shown that the maximum lactate goes down, and they had generated in the end of the GDR a population of rowers who were not able to generate lactate in a higher level to the high volume endurance training. It was a selection, and maybe they had also problems with the performance. And we had this other study which was quoted. When you see here a training study with high intensity training, you see that the fiber type is not changing. It changed only in the break after the training. That means by training, we don't get always the fiber type which we want. We have a lot of post-translational changes. And that is due to that stress and fatigue. We did discuss that, Carsten and Kate, result from training. You see arbitrary training load and the stress, and we know that protein synthesis rate goes down after a training bout, and you need a break to get back on. And then now we're coming with that our strength training has often in rowing not a good effect. And endurance training gets to the slow type, and the strength training should go to the faster type, but it does not happen. It's like we want. So that is something that we have in our strengths endurance model. We have a problem that interactions between strength and endurance training. That regeneration is very important to eat enough, but sometimes it gets not pleasant rowers. So we go down to the term, what is endurance? And the problem is endurance is something which is in endurance training changes, has something which is everyone knows. That's an old study from 1990. Shows a lactate 2, lactate 2.5 and 4. And you see the oxygen consumption. You see that the oxygen consumption goes down to certain high levels to 65 mils at a lactate of 4 millimole. That means that you have a very high oxygen consumption at our routinely training loads. And we have data from elite rowers, a German rowing team, And you see here lactate 2, lactate 4, lactate threshold, and individual aerobic threshold where athletes are training, their endurance training. You see it's 5.5 liters of oxygen at this training center. And if you then go down, and this is connected now to Carson's and Kate's law, to the energy expenditure, you see here kilocalories in carbohydrates. You see that rowers depend highly on carbohydrates, even as endurance training. And this means that we get by our endurance training, we get a metabolic problem just by training, not only by eating. And so the issue was long in rowing that we try to increase efficiency. We have a lot of biomechanical inventory. We can try to get better rowing. I understand better rowing is better than bad rowing. So the coach is focusing on technique and getting better efficiency, like we do here as in the rowing course. And you see here the same. We have here a rower, and you have here the oxygen consumption 4.5 in low intensity training and 5.5 in high intensity training in actual rowing. That means we are really at 80 to 90% of VO2 max when we do our endurance training. So we have to say that measuring only performance as an lactate or VO2, that's not enough. Then we have to put total power output as a parameter in our training model. We have to move oxygen consumption as an ultimate stressor system or characteristic of the system, not only lactate curves. And this means that this very important has been also shown by Niels Seecher. Aerobic power is a determining factor for rowing success. And very old data, you see here higher oxygen consumption, higher likelihood of being effective. We have shown that you can measure oxygen consumption during rowing exercise with a high reliability of 9.8, even an individual athlete, but the problem is, and you say, okay, if it's so good correlated to performance, why don't we measure only performance and not VO2? We did it in a German junior team. You see, this is the duration of the test, and here's the maximum oxygen consumption. You see a very weak correlation here, and this is because we clear that the imprecision of a rowing ergometer is much higher than a cycle ergometer. That means that the VO2 calculated from the rowing ergometer performance is not equal to the real VO2, which is the rower expressing. So you need to measure VO2 max to get an information about VO2 max. You cannot calculate it. You see there's huge variation here if you look at the imprecision of rowing ergometers. So we did now a rowing ergometer test. Gunnar Treff has developed this step test where you can follow here a ramp, and you have a very good, excellent follow-up, and then we have a good measurement of VO2 max, and you see such a ramp test here, CO2, here VO2, and then you can have a good estimate of the maximum oxygen consumption. And the test is not as exhausting as a conventional 2,000 meter test. Oops. And that oxygen consumption is not only muscle mass, but it's also much more. Let's say, it shows this very old data showing that VO2 is increasing when you increase offer the rower more oxygen. This is a normal curve with normal ambient air. When it's hypoxic, the performance decreases, but if you offer more oxygen to the rower, which is not useful during a rowing race, you get an increased performance in oxygen uptake. And that means this old data showed clearly that our oxygen transport system in rowing is a problem. It's not only the muscles. And another data is here from Volanitis. You see here a simple experiment where a rower cycles. And then he adds arm exercise to the cycling, and the blood flow goes down. That means when an excellently trained Danish rower cycles on the erg and starts to get arm cranking, the blood flow is not sufficient enough for the whole body. And you see here the data, a long graph, but you see here, this is the data for arm, and that's for leg performance, and if you combine, the blood flow goes down. That's very interesting. And that means we have blood flow to the extremities is limiting. And I have here very old data that I was a doctoral student and did for myself rowing, and you see here a rowing ergometer test. That's the performance. It was not very good. This was IM, I think. And you see here there's oxygen pressure in the blood. And see the marked decrease of oxygen pressure during the 2,000 meter test. CO2 went up, and then the hyperventilation. You see we are in hypoxic condition during the maximum 2,000 meter race, and it's difficult to measure, but you see that the cardiovascular system is maximum determines the performance. And that means all the rowers have a higher stroke volume when they row than when they cycle. They have also a higher cardiac output when they row than when they cycle. So this means we have to measure much more sophisticated. We not only need rowing ergometers, we need also more sophisticated measurements like cardiac output measurements. We need more sophisticated measurements of oxygen consumption during our rowing training, because we should not only focus on strength and endurance training, we should also look at what is maximum. But I did not include in the slides, and I tried a little bit to cope up for a discussion, that we have also neurofunctions during this maximum exercise. You don't think really, now I only focus on cardiovascular, but the innovation of during a rowing race is different from an endurance training. And we have also to think about neuromuscular control and higher brain control during such exercises. And if you look at the red discussion of Kate, that fits also very clearly together, that if you fatigue the rower too much, you get quality of all systems go down. That endocrine goes down and so on. And I have one of the rowers you showed me, we have muscle biopsies, and we had a very severe overtraining syndrome and fatigue syndrome. We did muscle biopsies, everything, and we have everything, all axes were down, and we had also in the muscles there was a decreased protein turnover and so on. Thank you very much. So we say rowing is unique, it's maximum. Don't talk so much about strength endurance sports, say it's a real maximum sport. And a real maximum sport needs this 2,000 meters, needs this unique competition that we have in rowing. Thank you very much.
We have 5 minutes, I think, for questions, because Jürgen made up some time for the other two of us.
Yeah, but Carsten can also come to here. I think Carsten comes here. And or you take a microphone and we can make a discussion together. Oops. Are there questions? Please identify you with name and affiliation. I know who is Gianni, but yeah.
Okay, no, it's good. Thank you very much. Are many years that I would like to know. Maybe also other coaches have the same way of thinking. Can you describe to us what means fast-twitch fibers or slow-twitch fibers? For example, in the 8, if there are 8 rowers, like now, they go 525, 520. Do they have 75, 80% of slow-twitch fibers? Is it where is the limit of speed that we can give a good definition of fast and slow fibers? Thank you.
I think that is really a problem. If you have more muscles, you can overcome the effect of having more slow fibers if you have more muscle hypertrophy. But we know now if you have too much muscle hypertrophy to overcome the type 1 fiber characteristics, that's also not a good way. We try in all sports now not to have too much fiber hypertrophy. We try to have an athlete who is in a proportion of fiber type or something. And this is very difficult to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Lucy Free from United Kingdom. Kate, you told us the markers for this reduced energy, and Dr. Kohler, you were very clear that weight is not a good measurement. Do either of you have any helpful, useful, on-the-ground feeling measurement thing that could be more useful, please?
So I think this is where sometimes the labs can come in helpful. So obviously everybody doesn't have access to a DEXA. We do, and he does in his lab, I do in my clinic. I have patients referred to me. She's telling me to slow down. It's too much coffee today. Who I am able to do a bone density on, and I can get that body composition, so I can give that back. Yeah, I'm going to get there. And then the other thing is if they can actually see a clinician who can do very basic labs. So you could look for the white blood cell count, or you could look for the thyroid difference. If you are a coach, in general, what I have found with even our lightweight rowers is when they have a BMI below 19.5, typically you should start wondering if they have some menstrual dysfunction. So it used to be that anorexia nervosa was defined as a BMI below 18.5, but for our athletes, they typically will start to get menstrual dysfunction below 20, below 19.5. So you could use the screening questionnaires, you could use the LEAF-Q, you could use the LEAM-Q, and you could also bring in your dietitian just to do a quick consult.
Okay, I think a couple of things I would add is actually, you mentioned questionnaires. There's some, Bronwyn had in her study from 2017, they saw some increase in fatigue. So even those things, POMS may be a good questionnaire to look at, profile of mood states, or even just, I think Kate pointed out that very well, listen to the athlete very specifically. There's not a single symptom that we can say this is the best one. I think with female athletes, if there's an issue with their period, I think it's very strong. But after all, pay attention to any of these, increased risk of injury, increased prevalence of infections. These kind of things will tell, usually they tell a story. It's not a singular thing. It's not a single marker that will tell you. And if some things happen with male athletes, send them for a lab workup as well to make sure to check their testosterone. That's not that expensive again.
Even with the male athletes, they might not have really, really suppressed testosterone, but somebody needs to ask them if they have a decrease in libido. These young athletes should actually get morning erections every morning, believe it or not. And if you ask about a change in sexual function or a change in morning erections, maybe not a good question for a coach to be asking, but something I need to be asking my male athletes in an endocrine clinic, the answer is usually yes. And they just haven't thought about it. They just thought it was related to their training, but it's really related to their energy availability and their overreaching.
But are there other measures? That's something we are talking about energy availability, and it's the most tricky thing is to ask a dietitian to make a 3 days food questionnaire, because it's so much cumbersome for the athletes to get real results. What we are doing to measure ahead of the problem what you are doing when the athletes undereat or overtrain?
Well, I think there's two issues. The first issue is to make them aware of that they need to eat more. I think it depends on where the underlying issue is. If it's a lack of knowledge, so I think if you have an increase in training load and if you don't have an increase in food intake, something. It may be either knowledge or lack of time, lack of availability of food to kind of think around. We count calories in the lab, but I would never advise anyone to count calories outside. It's terribly inaccurate. It doesn't make any sense. Don't do food logs. But look out for these things. Depending on how much you train, time becomes an issue. We know that exercise, especially high-intensity exercise, as you pointed out, suppresses appetite. So you may not feel like refueling between sessions, but you have multiple sessions. So I can't put it in numbers. I'm sorry, I would like to, but it's really
But I think
difficult.
a consult with a dietitian, that's what they do so well, and I would implore anybody working with any rowing team to have a dietitian available to them so that they can have that one-on-one time with the athlete to really pick apart the diet and come up with practical suggestions for them to find ways to refuel after working out or pre-workout.
Yanis Pitsiadis, thank you to all the speakers. Have you considered the composition of the diet when someone is on a hypercaloric diet? The reason I ask that is that I've been studying the East African runners for 20 years now, and they are constantly on a diet that is hypocaloric. But the way they get around it with having less issues is that they are eating approximately an 80% carbohydrate diet, which turns out to be between 10 and 12 grams per kilogram body weight. So they're getting a lot of carbohydrates, so they're not glycogen depleted or reduced glycogen levels. Could some of the problems you're seeing be explained by the fact that in the cases that you used, the athletes may be eating a diet that is not as high in carbohydrate, and therefore they can't do the sessions, and that goes into the kind of overtraining area, and they cause a lot of those problems. Because we don't see the same level of problem in the East African runners who themselves, you try and tell them to eat a diet that is isocaloric, they'll say no way. Any comments on that?
I can go first. I think you have a good point. I think we're going away from carbohydrates because they're terrible, or they're labeled as terrible. But I think there's a lot of good evidence, especially if you're doing high training load, and especially high aerobic training. I think I have talked to Ann Laux. She's never published the data, but she did calculate something like a carbohydrate availability index as well for her data, and saw a very good correlation. Now again, the thing that she manipulated was energy, and it's one of the 3 macronutrients. It's the one that you want or you can manipulate. I think the best. You need a little bit of fat. With protein, again, I've pointed out that we're seeing some of the retention of lean mass, possibly retention of strength. That's very, very specific. But I think we don't know enough about the composition. But usually they're connected to each other. So it's very difficult to eat a high carbohydrate diet that is. I know your case, but in like the Western runners or Western athletes, it's very difficult to see a high carbohydrate diet that is isocaloric, for example, just out of practicality.
I think the problem arises in particular in rowing when you have longer training times, because if you see the data from our lab and others, if you're in 90 minutes, you get in a border where you're totally out of any carbohydrates. You're much earlier out of carbohydrates, but then you get really in problems where you have to generate your carbohydrates from your protein breakdown, and that is a real problem. And so you have to split training in several issues per day. You can not do this prolonged training that old people here did in GDR. That is really tremendous problem, and you cannot eat it. The carbohydrates you have to eat, you're not able to eat, and that makes a sense why more polarized training programs come now in fashion. Not because endurance training is not bad, but it's not tolerated in the high level which people compete.
think just two comments. I agree with what you're saying. I think carbs are getting a bad rap. We certainly have a lot of people out there talking about the high fat, low carb trend. I think that works for people who are at risk of diabetes and people who are a little less active, but we certainly need to be remembering that these people that we're talking about, rowers, are doing a ton of exercise. If you look at the other endurance literature, runners, triathletes, cyclists, they're able to get the carbs during the workout. It's a little bit trickier when you have oars in your hands and you can't pick them up, but we've got to get them in the boat. And we have preliminary data suggesting that there are effects on bone turnover, negatively so, if there aren't enough carbs in the diet. Clinically, most of my patients who are coming in with low energy availability are buying into that high carb, low fat, high fat, high protein, low carb myth, and they need to get more carbs in their diet. And when they're correcting that, their labs are improving.
Thank you, Catherine, for pointing that out, because also we should remember that in our evolutionary history, we've done very well by starving, so it can't be a bad thing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for attending this session and for the nice questions. We tried a little bit to hurry up, and we get a nice discussion at the very end. There is now a coffee break for refueling, and then in 15 minutes is we starting to the next session. Very short, it's just a notice that the conference is live streamed and to YouTube. The address is on the FISA website, and there will be also the recordings will be saved and published after discussion on the FISA website.
Yes. Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are now going into the second session, understanding training. So this is Mikio Hira from FISA Sports Medicine Commission and coming from Japan, the Center for Brain Sciences Center in Aomori University. And next to me, Professor Pistaris coming from University Brighton, and as well as IOC Medicine and Scientific Committee, and as well as for WADA committees.
Thank you, Dr. Hira, and thank you to all of you for being here. The session is promising to be as exciting as the first one, so I'm pleased you've taken your seats. I am used to, when being in Germany, things running especially on time. As some of you know, I'm Greek, and in Greece we're very late, but here we're also being quite late. But I will give our speakers the 30 minutes they've been allocated, which means we will be running a little bit late, but I hope you don't mind. But given the quality of speakers, I think you won't mind. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Bernd Wolfhardt, who's been a friend for many, many years. I've been following his work with a lot of interest. He's really an opinion leader in the area of sports genomics. He's been on all the gene maps that have been published in all these years from the American College of Sports Medicine. So he will inform us today where the field has got. So I really look forward to hearing your talk. Over to you, Bernd.
Yes. So thanks, Janis. A very warm welcome to Berlin. Today it's a nice meeting for me because, you know, it's about 10 minutes for me to come from my clinic, which is the Charité here in the middle of Berlin, to that place. So I was also the latest one who arrived, which is quite normal for those who have the shortest distances. And about the time, you know, we are exactly in the scientific quarter, we say in Germany, so we are just right in time. Okay. So I need the first slide. Could I get that one? Yes. Understanding training, what do we learn from genomics? It's a good question. Janis told you that I'm in the field since a couple of years, and as you are not specialists in that field, I try to give you a little wrap-up over the last 20 years, what happened and where we are now. And it's all the time difficult to bring that down to practice. And if I remember the time when I went into that field, it was in the late 90s. I came to Claude Bouchard, and at that time he told me, Bernd, we are looking for a monogene effect, and we will find that endurance gene. Nowadays we are far away from that, and we know something more, but we are also let's say a little bit more grounded than we were 20 years ago. And I hope I can give you a little insight in that. So there was in 1997 a very nice paper which was published at that time about Drosophila larvae. And when those larvae are looking for food, some of them are very, very slow and others are very quick. So we are looking for sitters and rowers. And there was one paper published in Science where they brought that back to one simple polymorphism. And this polymorphism was in the GMP-dependent protein kinase of those Drosophila larvae. And it was interesting because with transgenic methods, they were able to bring that on and off. So they were able to transfer sitters to rowers and back again. And that belonging to one simple genetic variation. So this brought James Truman at that time to say this is not something that's going to just apply to insects. So he thought it could be also of importance for human beings. And if we look to our human beings. So I drive a big outpatient clinic. I don't see only high-performance athletes. I also see these guys coming with type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome. Those are more or less sitters. And of course, we have these guys. I had the pleasure to take care of that one when he won 3 gold medals 2006 in Torino. Those, of course, are rowers. But, the question is, are they different in any way beside the phenotype? So if we look to the very early twin studies, which were conducted in the 80s, there we mostly were looking for monozygotic twins, and we saw that their genetics are, of course, the same, and their phenotypes, when they were training or even in a basic condition, were very close to each other. And of course, if we are looking to sport, we often see some of these twins performing very much the same when they are performance athletes. So the big question is, what is nature and what is nurture? So what is really genetic predisposition and what is, at the end of the day, adaptation? And another very nice example is this one. We have monozygotic twins. Both have exactly the same genetics. But, the left one decided to be a middle distance runner, and the right one decided to be a weightlifter. So what we can see is that they act very, very different, even if they have exactly the same genetic background. If we go to some of the big studies, so the heritage study was for sure the biggest one we had in our history for the genetics. And I was in Quebec City with Claude Bouchard at that time when they performed the heritage study. So they were looking for more than 750 people, 750 subjects of families, white families, black families. They had about 200 families at that time, and they were looking for the adaptation of training after 20 weeks of very much standardized training sessions. And what you can see here on that graph is that they reacted fairly different between families. On the left-hand side, you see some families in total, they were training for 20 weeks, and I really thought that could not be. Going to training under very standardized circumstances, 20 weeks, and there is no effect at all, even a negative effect. So measuring their VO2 max brought 0 delta between the first day and after 20 weeks of training. So on the other hand, you had the same family or the same training in some families where almost all of the family members had the almost opposite reaction. They were gaining up to 1,000 milliliters of VO2 in 20 weeks of the same identical training. So when we were measuring the maximal heritability levels, we saw about 47% of the change in those 20 weeks was genetically dependent. Nowadays, we think that between 25 and 40% of the variation of the phenotype is based on the genotype. So far, so good. But the question now is, with some new methods, we are able to look for specific genes. And of course, it would be interesting to know which genes are responsible for these changes. That means which genes are really involved in the determination of aerobic performance and trainability. And of course, for us, of a lot of interest, is it possible to predict aerobic performance and trainability levels in humans using these genetic markers? It's a question of talent detection which we have. And thinking about clinics, most of us, we are physicians. It would be pretty perfect to know who is a responder and who is a non-responder in terms, for example, of clinical therapy strategies. So all of these of us who are involved in clinical work know that we have some patients, we bring them to exercise and they react very fast, and we are almost able for those with with type 2 diabetes or hypertension to really exclude medication and bring them with their exercise to regular values. And others we can bring to the gym and nothing happens over weeks, over months, over years. And they, of course, they have to be treated with medication. And so what we are talking about at the moment is not really of impact for sports performance. It's a general question we have to solve. It was in, I think this was 2011 when I was together with Yannis. We were writing a book chapter and we summarized all the current studies. And I will show you one study I was working in over some years. And the idea came when I was in Quebec about 20 years ago. It was the Gene Athlete study. And at that time, Claude Bouchard had the Heritage study, and he thought if we could find some people with really very, very different phenotypes, we could be able to have a closer look, to have an internal replication study, to take the findings out of the Heritage study and to look for these findings, for these genes, for these polymorphisms in a second study which was called Gene Athlete. And this was the plan, to find about 600 subjects, 300 highly trained endurance athletes, elite endurance athletes, and 300 sedentary controls. And the goal was to find those athletes with a VO2 max above 75 milliliters per kilogram. All of you know that those are really high performers, and to take only sedentary controls who have a maximum O2 uptake below 50 milliliters per kilogram. And then the idea at that time was, of course, to look for candidate genes. At that time, this was straightforward. This was state of the art. We were collecting, and it took a while. We were collecting about 10, 15 years until we had those 600 athletes and controls together. But we succeeded, and we were looking for these athletes in America, in Finland, in Germany. And of course, we tried to find the same number of controls in the same countries with the same genetic background. So it was fairly good. We had 315 athletes, 305 controls. From different endurance sports. You can see those guys from cycling, cross-country, running, biathlon. Of course, I'm the head physician of the German biathlon team since 20 years, and I brought these guys within the study. And at the end of the day, we had at least some very different VO2 max values. You can see we had in our athlete group almost 80 milliliters per kilogram in average. So we still had guys in there with 84, 85, 86 milliliters per kilogram. And on the other hand side, we were around 40 milliliters per kilogram in our control group. So we could say they are phenotypically very far from each other, and we had the hope, of course, that they are genetically also different, and we are able to look for different polymorphisms, different gene interactions in these two groups. So what we did at that time was we did a simple candidate gene approach, and this was, of course, very easy, and from the perspective of today, more low level, but we were looking for the biology behind. We were running behind our biology nose. We thought, what is important for sports? Yes, of course, the hormones are interesting. Muscle, lipoprotein metabolism was a candidate. But things are not so easy in life, and so we did a lot of research, and from the perspective of nowadays, we did not find too much. I will come to that later. But at that time, even we also looked for some other pathways which are not directly related to endurance at the first look. So like cellular mediators, like oncogenes and others. So we hoped even at that time that we could get a broader view. I will bring you to one nice thing which happened also about 20 years ago to give you an example that life is not so easy. So I name it the ACE story. Yannis knows that getting reviews about ACE for at least 15 years or something. If we look back nowadays, maybe one reason was it was so easy to detect in the lab. And when I started in Claude Bouchard's lab, I used that techniques, and it was really beautiful in the lab to see these nice pictures. I did that gels by myself, and it was really easy to see the different genotypes. And so it was tempting, of course, to look to differences in these genes. And the good thing was in the ACE that we had a biology, a physiology behind. That means that we had a direct interaction between the genotype and ACE activity, which we were measuring in plasma. And of course, we looked at this, and then we had a really unbelievable publication. We had a Nature paper about ACE, and at that time, it was almost like the German Bild-Zeitung. They named the article "A Gene for Physical Performance." And so I thought, okay, Claude was right. We had a monogene effect in that case. What they did, they were looking for two different experiments. One was with mountaineers, and they were simply looking which mountaineers were able to go above 7,000 meters of height without supplementary oxygen. And they found that a specific variation of this gene was more frequent in those who were able to come to very high heights without supplementary oxygen. This for itself, with those really low numbers, wouldn't have been publishable, of course not in Nature, but they had a second experiment, and this was an intervention study with some British recruits, and they were looking for 10 weeks of weight training, and they were looking for the same polymorphisms, and they found that those with the specific genotype they were looking, those were the insertion homozygotes in that case, had an 11-fold greater improvement to the training compared to those who had the homozygote D genotype. So again, they named it a gene for physical performance. What did we at that time? We had our Gene Athlete study, not 600, but almost 400 subjects, and we thought, okay, let's look to Gene Athlete, and those guys who are here, the II genotypes, should be our high performers. And so we went to Gene Athlete, and what we saw at that time, it was disappointing at all. So we saw the exactly same distribution for our controls compared to our elite athletes. Then we thought, okay, maybe this is something which applies only to the very, very high performers. And so we went back to our athletes, and we were looking for those above 82 milliliters per kilogram. Those are not growing on the trees. Those are very, very special. And we had at least, I will have to look, 40 of those. So we had 40 subjects with a VO2 max over 82 milliliters per kilogram. And even those were not different, not to those with 75 or 80 milliliters per kilogram, and not to those with 40 milliliters per kilogram, that means to our controls. And so, in our opinion, it was pretty much clear that there is no direct relation, at least not between performance in terms of aerobic performance and the ACE. Over the years, we saw that most likely statistical problems brought us to the initial idea that the ACE genotype could mean anything, and we saw that with more subjects, all those relevant differences were gone in almost all studies and in almost all different questions that we were looking for. What are the recent approaches? So, with our Gene Athlete behind, we started 2012 to look how we could go to modern techniques, not look to simple genotypes, not look to even simple polymorphisms. And we were starting to a genome-wide approach. So we did a genome-wide search for DNA segment variants and thought maybe we find something in our Gene Athlete cohort. Nowadays we are using some chip approaches. This was a cardiometabolic chip from Illumina, and we are able, what I did in the lab with a lot of work for one single polymorphism, which took me over one afternoon to detect about 20 athletes or something like that. Nowadays, we have 145,000 SNPs in one row, which are running through the machine, and we have, of course, a lot of results. It's not easy to take the statistics for that, but of course, those are much more strong and more meaningful tests. What we found was not nothing, but also not too much. We were at least able to detect a kind of genomic summary score, I will name it, but we now know that we even need scores. A single polymorphism means nothing, a single SNP means nothing, and even if we take these into account, we can maximum 1 to 2% per SNP which will be a quote to explain us the difference in the phenotypic difference we see in our athletes. So what did we learn about out of that it's a long way and a very complicated measurement. So looking ahead to the gene athlete, we saw, of course, that some SNPs are related to our gene athlete group with regards to the VO2 max, not with high percentages of explanation, and those SNPs were mainly related to cardiovascular function, insulin metabolism, and apoptosis. Replication studies are the key, and this is really the big problem what we have nowadays, that our subjects, our groups, our cohorts in that science area are still very small. So what we did next was we were looking for a meta-study. Yannis also brought a couple of athletes and a couple of subjects within. At that time we had at least 3,500, which is a decent number. We published that, but even with that number, we were not able to find a real difference between our athletes and our controls, even using those big chip approaches. What is the idea for future research? Of course, I think the only chance we have is that we continue with data pooling. We have to bring together major studies, and number of subjects is the key in that research. I'm pretty sure that we need more animal models to combine the idea, and other techniques, newer techniques will be developed. We have some of these different approaches published in our yearly MSSE report. The last one was published in 2016. For those of you who are interested, they are able to read what are the latest news and the latest studies in that field. I will come back to one study to give you an impression what's going on with that. It's not a pretty new one, but this gives us an idea how we could maybe react in future. This was 2011 published from the group from Pernille Keller. Claude Bouchard was also one of the protagonists in that experiment, and they were combining different methods, different molecular biology methods, and I think this will be more or less the future. But of course, it's very expensive to perform that. And we were just talking, Yannis and me. Unfortunately, it's not too much money in our scientific regions when we are focusing on elite sports. This is a real problem. But what they did they combined human studies with animal studies, and I will not go into details. It was transcriptomics, what they did in the human studies. They looked for a couple of skeletal muscle gene transcripts and made a map, went also back to heritage, looked at those who really performed very well and those who performed not as good, and they were able to again combine a a panel of subjects which they looked in detail. And then, and this was very interesting, they looked for these genes also in a rodent model. So they combined it with some animal studies where they breeded out some special rats for performance phenotypes. And I think with that approach, we could be able in future to look at these genetic questions more complex, and we need to really build our own replication studies in our labs in collaboration with some other labs to get the power to really get more, let's say, reliable results out of that when we once in a while bring, or when the intention is to bring those results to practice. If I go to summary and future perspectives, the marker and SNP data are for sure easily to access nowadays, but that doesn't help if we don't have the real resources, the real sources also for our scientific data. I think we have a good basis for our statistical methods, but again, also the statistical methods itself only helps if we have good cohorts and if we have the good resources to look at. There are a couple of bullet points we have to think about. Replication is really a major point. So nowadays we should not accept any papers which are brought into journals without a real replication or without an internal replication. The clinical implementation has to be based on a big scale confirmation, definitely. Another problem or another question is, do we have different ethnical groups we have to look at? This is a major point from which we also can learn a lot. And of course, we need different omics to bring together, and I think this will be the biggest challenge for the future. We need to have a broad view, and the monogenetic approach is definitely not the one we need to solve our problems and to answer our questions. One last point I will talk about is screening for talent, because this is the question which comes most often to coaches, to us as scientists as well as physicians. And the question is it possible with the information we have nowadays, or is it more a fiction? And it was a pleasure for me with Yannis together to publish a paper. It's now 5 years ago that we published that, but to tell you the truth, not too much happened since that time. Only the title I really like, I still like. I think it was a title, I don't know, was it Yannis or Guang who came to that title? It's your finger, okay. Genomics of elite sporting performance, what little we know and necessary advances. And this is really the question for us, what little we know. And we had really summarized in a nice box a lot of findings, and looking at that I will just highlight, and I think this is really important maybe for you when you're discussing with coaches or for the coaches who are here. And this was one sentence I still have in my mind, and I still often cite myself when I'm asked. Current genetic testing has zero predictive power on talent identification and should not be used by athletes, coaches, or parents. There are a lot of offers in the internet, and you can send your salvia or your cells or your blood to wherever, and they will give you an idea whether you can go more to endurance or more to strength. And at the moment, we have scientifically speaking no real evidence to give you an answer to that question. So at the end of the day, I think we have still a little bit more quality in our papers. This came over the last years. We are a little bit more realistic as we were 20 years ago. Nowadays, from studies with small sample sizes, we should not accept any papers which are sent to journals. The direction, of course, goes in the direction of planned and prospective studies. And we need, and this is one very important point, we need measured and robust phenotypes. And this might have been also a problem we had in the last years. And this is maybe a bit more the future. I don't know if Wilhelm will talk a little bit about that. Gene-gene and gene-environment interactions, especially the gene-environment interactions. What we also name with epigenetics, it's a question of definition, but this is what we finally have, will be much more important and will be more and more important. And definitely we need to have some omics more to combine our view of the biology. And now coming back to the basics, this is not the way how we can produce athletes in future. We need a little bit more, not this approach, a little bit more this approach. And when we try really hard, then we will have an outcome like this. And I had the pleasure to take care of these guys and these little strong women. And of course, for a physician, it's really nice to bring these athletes healthy to the start so that they are able to really bring their maximum performance to a Olympic event and to an Olympic medal in that case. And I think this is worthwhile to work for. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Bent. You beautifully basically indicated the big issues that existed then and exist now. I was very interested to see the beginning of your talk about the citizen rovers. I actually moved to Glasgow to work with Kim Kaiser, who had done those experiments. Unfortunately, passed away a few months after I arrived. But it's very interesting what you said, because I've just attended a meeting in Shenzhen, China, where these problems are also the problems of the Human Genome Project, and the point that you made about overselling. So, open to questions. We have time for questions. Questions?
We are still in the scientific quarter.
I have plenty of questions. If you're not going to ask, I will, but please, let's have you interact. Don't be shy.
So maybe you start.
Okay, so you also heard from Bent there that, you know, some of those early studies wouldn't be publishable today. I disagree that they won't be publishable today in terms of the experiments. What's lacking now, and it was also very clear at this big meeting in China a few weeks ago, is everyone's collecting more and more and more and more big data. But they're forgetting our role, the physicians in the room, the physiologists in the room, the coaches in the room, and the good phenotype. That we need to actually do those experiments rather than actually just sequence the whole population. So I think, you know, what we learned in the past is relevant today. What we need to do is improve our technology. So if we had better technology then, would our conclusions be different? My question.
Yeah, definitely, and I addressed it, of course, on my last slide. This is exactly what we should look for. I mentioned that we need the good phenotype, and if we have a really good phenotype, and if we think then about intervention studies and prospective studies, then we will come down from those high numbers we need. Then we can look very specifically. And at the moment, I think we need those big numbers really to be a little bit more selective for what genes and markers we were looking for. But then we have to go back to smaller experiments with really nice phenotypes, with clearly specified genotypes. And then we will be able to answer some of those questions, but with a more specific approach. And this is definitely the future.
Exactly, and the Chinese have just announced they're going to sequence 500 million individuals. But the point is, are they going to phenotype them properly?
Yes.
So that's the point.
Definitely not.
Question over to Jürgen.
It's also the other question in heritage. We had phenotyping is one problem, but it's also the question of training. Did receive these families appropriate training?
At least they received all the same training. That, of course, that question is a good question. You might have been able to optimize the outcome for an individual when you had been able to do a very individual approach of training. But I think this was not the idea in the study. It was exactly the idea to give the same amount of training to a big group, to standardize to a maximum. And it was, for me, beside all the genetic data, really impressive to see that some people even get worse when they go to training, and others almost double their VO2. And this was one of the major outcomes in Heritage under a very, very standardized way. Of course, you had been able to optimize the success with an individual approach, but this was not a question for the study.
Okay, I must guillotine the discussion there. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Bernd. Well, the baton is being passed over to Willem Block, who I was saying early on to him, that we keep on meeting at events, but he's always flying out before I have time to meet and talk to him. So I've spoken to at a number of events with him, but I've never had the chance to really discuss science with him. So I very much look forward to hearing your talk. And as you know, Dr. Block is from the German Sports University in Cologne. I very much look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Johannes. It was really, we meet us often, but we have no time to speak. Yeah. I would go to the next step from the genome, and I always bring one point, the functional genome. Bernd told I could possibly a little bit, or give a little bit insight in this part, but it's not in my talk today. Because what we do is, and what I like to explain a little bit, some mechanism of post-transcriptional regulation of training adaptation. It helps possibly to understand training and the training effects. Yesterday evening I left out my lab, and one of my PhD was there, and I told him, okay, tomorrow I go to Berlin and speak about post-transcriptional regulation of training adaptation. And he said, oh, a wide field. Okay, good. What is the goal of training is performance enhancement. And you have a lot of adaptations. You have functional adaptations, structural adaptations. And mostly we look to the muscle fibers, but the muscle isn't only muscle fibers. And also in my talk, I would like to go in the second part to the other parts of the muscle and the post-transcriptional regulation in these parts. Okay, and when we look what means post-transcriptional processes induced by physical training and regeneration, that's a really nice model from Martin Flück, and it shows, okay, you train, you make RNA transcription, that means of the transcriptional level, and on the other side you make a protein degradation, and what you need is protein synthesis, protein motylation, autophagy, I explain it later a little bit more, protein turnover, and at the end protein modulation, and all of them can optimize structure and function. And at the beginning, if you have transcription, then you have an RNA, but this RNA is further processed by a post-transcriptional process. And the starting process of post-transcriptional regulation is the alteration of the stability and viability of this mRNAs by so-called microRNAs. Long time we thought, okay, a part of our genome and the transcripts of our genomes are not usable, the so-called introns. Now we know that we can, from these introns, so-called microRNAs processed, and these microRNAs make a modulation of the RNA availability and the stability, and this changes then the translational process, and protein synthesis is changed. That can lead to some adaptation in the muscle. I have here an example where you see acute and chronic response, and you see some microRNAs which are downregulated after resistance training and after an acute response and chronic response, and what you have on the end, you have a change of the protein synthesis, you have a change of the mitochondrial biogenesis and myogenic differentiation. That means at the end, these microRNAs plays a very important role to alterate the viability of this RNA. But more as the this, these microRNAs work not only in the cell in which they are produced, they can distribute it over the body. And this is a very interesting point. That means you make microRNAs, such transcripts in your muscle or in the endothelial cells and the capillaries of the muscle, and you can distribute by different ways this microRNAs over the whole body, and this can then lead to the other cells in the body can pick up these microRNAs and can regulate transcriptional processes by this way. This is a very interesting point. And we have shown in a study that microparticles, in dependency of the kind of training, and this is the interesting point, if you make high volume training, high intensity training, you release such microRNAs in the body and from the endothelial cells, and you transfer it to vascular smooth muscle cells by the microparticle, and sure, they can pick it up and they change the vascular smooth muscles, and they can also change the endothelial function and biology. Okay, this is a starter for, and because it's a real first post-transcriptional process. Now I would like to go a little bit more to post-translational processes, which come at the next step. And very nice examples for me is functional adaptation by such processes. And mechanisms of fast loss of muscle power. It's very interesting also. You lost over 30 cycles, you lost 30% of your power, and then it's a question why you lost this speed, why you lost this power. And this is really in post-translational regulation by protein modulation. And the mechanism behind, that's a very interesting mechanism, is the alteration of the fast calcium regulation, because if you would like to make a muscle contraction, you need a very fast oscillation of calcium. You must release the calcium from the intracellular calcium stores, the sarcoplasmatic reticulum, outside, and then you change the concentration in very fast fibers around 100 times, in slow fibers around 10 times, and then in the relaxation phase you must pick up back in the sarcoplasmatic reticulum. That's the process. It is regulated by a lot of such post-transcriptional, post-translational processes. You see a lot of molecules are involved. But I make it a little bit simpler, or a little bit simple. 2008, I was in the morning in the train, and I read a paper from Bellinger, from the Marx group in Los Angeles, and they described a new mechanism in the skeletal muscle, which was already known for the heart muscle. They described that phosphorylation of the renin receptor, that's the calcium release channel in the sarcoplasmatic reticulum, the intracellular calcium tanks. And this channel can be phosphorylated in a post-translational modification, and if it is phosphorylated, then it starts to lack calcium. And this is bad, because if you have a calcium lack, then you cannot have such a strong calcium oscillation. You lost power, or you lost at the end speed. But the interesting point, as I read this paper, then I thought, okay, this is important, it's interesting, but I thought, okay, that's not really the story. That was the point, because they describe, okay, we made with in a mouse model 30 minutes downhill running, and calcium oscillation is a process which makes a very fast fatigue, and you lost muscle power very fast. If you change this process, it's one of the fastest processes to change your muscle power. And therefore I thought, okay, 30 minutes, it gives a lot of mechanisms which can regulate the muscle power over this 30 minutes. If you have ion channels, or you have your energy stores also, and H plus mechanisms also on. Therefore, we have performed an own study where we have done only 65 seconds under tension, and then we looked for the ryanodine receptor, first for the density. We looked for the type 1, type 2 fibers, and you see the density of this channel is stable. That was not surprising. But now we look for the phosphorylation. And what you see, starting the first biopsy 50 minutes after, the second biopsy 30 minutes, and the next biopsy 60 minutes after. And what you see is you have a clear increase of regulator of the phosphorylation, but here you see of the channel, and here you see a hyperphosphorylation of the channel. That was an interesting point. But it is also another information inside. The information is, if you have a phosphorylation and the occurs, they stay for 60 minutes. And yet then you can think about what is the meaning for the pre-warming of or warming of your athlete. We can discuss it later. Okay. What I mean is ryanodine phosphorylation is such a post-transcriptional or post-translational process. It's a fast process and stay for a relevant time. A reduction of calcium regulation should be avoided before competition. I answered it a little bit. Yeah, okay. So now we come to another kind of regulation, which is also in the way of ryanodine receptor, because the Bellinger group shows then in the Nature paper some months later that not only phosphorylation is involved in this regulation of the ryanodine receptor, show also that nitric oxide, NO, is also involved. If you have a very high nitric oxide production, then you have also a drop down of the ryanodine receptor activity, or you get a leak of the receptor. By side of them, you see also, then you can see that the nitric oxide react with oxygen radicals and can also inhibit or reduce the activity of the calcium pump, which pumps the calcium back to the sarcoplasmatic reticulum. It's also a process which slow down this fast calcium oscillation and slow down your power and makes the muscle very fast fatigue. And on the other side, you see also the oxygen radicals directly regulate also or react also with myofilaments and change also the reactivity and the viability of the myofilament process. Okay, now it's easy. Then we can say, okay, now we know something else. We can do and we can perform antioxidants during training to avoid post-translational modifications. That's fine. Okay, now look to this thing, and what you see here is, okay, NO, oxygen radicals, and also the oxygen radical products and so on. But what you see here and go on, you have post-translational modification of proteins in different ways. And what is the effect? Not only drop down, partially drop, it's also a rise of the activity. That means it's not so easy to understand and to intervene with such a simple use of antioxidants. That is for me a very important message, because a lot of people do it, and I would say, okay, at this point you have post-translational modifications, and you should avoid to intervene in this biological, very complex biological process. So now we come to the stiffness of the muscle, and that's a really nice, very easy slide. No, it's not so easy. What you see is here, you see the molecule, the biggest molecule in the muscle, the titin molecule, which spans the whole sarcomere, and this molecule is very important for the stiffness, for the elasticity of the muscle fibers. Okay, But you can change this molecule. You see this molecule has a lot of different sites, reaction sites, enzymatic sites, and so on, and it regulates a lot of processes, also protein turnover in the muscle. Why is this important? You stretch your muscle before you start to make in competition, no? Yeah. The question is how you stretch. Passive, without activation of the muscle, or active with activation of the muscle, and then you stretch. Yeah, but if you look at this point on this post-translational modification of the titin fiber, then you change also the stress and the stiffness of your titin molecules, which makes a big difference for the force production of the muscle. This is an important point, and therefore you should think about if you make an active stretch, you make the muscle a lot more stiff, and the titin fibers much more stiff, and you get much more power at the moment. Okay, but the story is also not so easy. That's the story from our group, where we have done in a rat model treatment running for 15 minutes, and then we looked in two muscles, in the cardiac muscle and in the skeletal muscle, for the stiffness and on the phosphorylation of the titin molecules. I make a chart. In the heart, you get an increase of the stiffness after 15 minutes. In the muscle, in the skeletal muscle, you have the opposite. So you lost stiffness. What means that for the function? That means in the heart, the muscle function is improved, and the skeletal muscle, it's impaired. Okay, but possibly it makes sense, because if you need a longer time, then the muscle must protection for injuries, and if you have an overload and overuse of the muscle, the skeletal muscle, and this is possibly a protection mechanism. On the other side, in the heart, if you have a longer exercise, you need a well-functioning heart. Okay, and this is something new, and I would like to show it because it shows us how complex the process is. It's the same as with the DNA and with the snaps and so on. What you see here is an easy experiment. What we have done exercise, resistance exercise with 30%, 40% of one repetition maximum, with a high amount of repetitions, around 25 in every set. And you see 5 sets, 10 sets, and after a 5-set training and a 10-set training in the set subjects, we have done a muscle biopsy. Okay, and then we have done a whole proteomic, phosphoproteomic analysis. And we get around 5,000 phosphorylation sites. And interesting is that if you look here, up and down, you have between 5 to 10 sets, you have a big change of phosphorylation sites. Phosphorylation sites of the proteins, and phosphorylation make or change the function of the proteins. Therefore, this was for me a very interesting point, because you have a fast oscillation of such processes, which makes it so difficult to say what a single protein does in a process. Okay, and now we come to something which is a little bit connected to that for the first session. Muscle needs permanent turnover. You change every day 1 to 2% of your muscle proteins, and this is a very important process. If you do it not, you are aged. I'm a little bit more aged. I have less protein turnover. A young athlete should have a high protein turnover. Why we need it? We need it to make the system, to have the system in an optimal condition, and you lost the proteins which are worse, and you get new good proteins. But this is we see it here, young and old, and mixed muscle protein synthesis. In the young guys, you make an exercise, and an eccentric exercise, then you can change the protein over, process or turnover up to 3% per day. You should not do every day. And in the old, it's not possible. You have a lower activation of this protein turnover. Okay, this process is regulated by different process and two main processes. That's the protein synthesis, and on the other side, the protein degradation. And I see it so, the protein degradation or protein, is it's the same kind important as protein synthesis. You need this protein turnover. You stay at the end, the protein mass stays stable, but you have a change, which is important to optimize your structure. And you can influence this process by hypoxia, and you can change this process by nutrition, and especially by amino acid supplementation. And we listen in the morning, protein was good to hold the muscle, but it's not only the point to get simply over the day and at every day time, or it's equal at which time you give proteins. No, these proteins are very important and give some key proteins which drive the process, which induce the translational process. It means the protein synthesis. And the most important amino acid is leucine, and arginine is also important. So I would give the proteins before the training, 1 or 2 hours. But now here, such a dynamic of this X6 phosphorylation, that is the process which initiate the protein synthesis and the protein production. And here also some biopsies 15-30 minutes after a resistant training made, and what you see is after 1, 2, up to 4 hours you have an optimum of activity of protein synthesis. That means after your training, the system for protein synthesis react relatively fast. Here are some quantifications at different, and you see here the optimum, and you see also that different kind of trainings make different effects. And the eccentric training here, the black bars, has the highest effect on protein synthesis. And it gives also difference between the fiber types. That means in the fiber type 2, the faster fiber type, eccentric training make more effect and make more protein synthesis induction as in the slower fibers. Okay. That means the kind of resistance training influenced protein synthesis fiber type specific for at least 24 hours. That's what we estimate. And now we must ask, what is with the protein breakdown? And this is a picture which I made by myself on the electron microscope. And what you see is pre-eccentric load, after eccentric load. And what you see here, really nice, recognizable sarcomeres. And here, not really nice. But it's, I wonder that this muscle make a real good contraction. But the difference is that's 24 hours after a 70-second time on attention intervention. It was a high load, but only 70 seconds time on attention. That's the DOMS situation, delayed onset muscle soreness. Okay. What you do in this process with this destruction or disturbance of the muscle structure, you induce specific processes, and one of these processes is autophagy. That means from the set line, you release molecules which induce the production of such kind of vesicles. That is also real from this muscle. And you see it, this vesicles surround then destroyed proteins, destroyed structures, and then they are recycled in these structures. This is the scheme which we have for the the molecular interactions, and you see it's more complex molecular interaction, and some of the molecules, for example here BAX3, it's very important in the cell line, plays a very important role to initiate such an autophagy process. But this process changed over the time. If you make exercise and over some weeks, then you change your amount of BAX3, of other heat shock proteins which are involved in this process. That means if you have a trained athlete, then he reacts different to a specific eccentric training. We know it at the beginning of a winter training. You make a hard training and you have a DOMS. 2-3 weeks later, you have no reaction and your muscle is good to it well at the next days. Okay, and this is an absolutely new picture. We have this unpublished data from our lab. What you also see here is concentric and additional eccentric load. We compared different kind of resistance training, and what you see after 12 weeks of training, the distribution of set line proteins is here relatively irregular after a training, after an acute training. And if you make eccentric training over the time, then you cannot disturb by one acute training the structure of the set line. This is a very important aspect because it shows us that we can adapt the molecular structure and the reactivity of the molecules by the kind of training. Okay. At the end, muscle plasticity is highest principle estimated. Post-transcriptional mechanisms are strongly involved. And these are only a part of this post-transcriptional mechanism, and I look a little bit on the time. I will make it short, and I will overspring some of the pictures, but my other goal today is to show also that also some post-transcriptional modification, protein processing, exist also outside of the muscle in the extracellular matrix. And this is shown here. Resistance training leads to a release of proteases in the extracellular matrix, and that can cleave then the extracellular matrix. And this can lead to a release of angiogenic factors, for example, which are stored in the ECM. And this can lead then to angiogenic processes and to capillary growth. And at the end, you make also see an post-translational alteration in the extracellular matrix. I would like to end here and not show all of these data, which could also explain what happens there. At the end, post-transcription is happening in the muscle fibers themselves, but also outside of the muscle in the extracellular matrix. You have a lot of processes which are induced by an acute bout of exercise, but also in a training situation. And I think that's often forgotten, and therefore we should also give mention to this aspect. Muscle adaptation is not only dependent from muscle fibers, it's also dependent from muscle structures in the muscle. That's my last message for today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much. We have time for some questions. Any questions? Microphone to Jürgen, please.
Thank you for your simple slides and make it, but you made some statements. One I think was very important, and I want to challenge this: give proteins ahead of training. Is that was made?
Yeah. Yeah, that's for me a very important message, because the question is often at which time point you should give proteins. And if you give the proteins 6 or 8 hours after the training, it's nice, but it's not optimal because specific proteins are needed to induce the protein synthesis process. You regulate the signaling, which allows then the translation and the protein synthesis by themselves. And this is the point. And if you do it too late, then you have no effect on this process. But it's not for all amino acids. I think we should look then that we also have the right nutrition to have also inside adenine and leucine and so on.
Yeah, you mentioned particularly these both amino acids. Are they very important? Or is that just because they're most abundant?
No. I think these key amino acids are important, really important. And what we have seen in another study over half a year of training, that without additional supplementation, then we have seen that especially with increase of training load, we drop down the leucine and adenine amount in the blood. That means the body needed.
Okay, one final question, please, because of time. No? Yes. Introduce yourself, please. Yes.
Hello. I'm a rowing coach. I'm not a physiologist, but I was a chemistry teacher. One of your slides, the title was NO, nitrogen monoxide, nitric oxide, its role in additional post-translational modulation.
Yeah.
Could you please explain from where the nitric oxide has come? What is the source of this nitric oxide?
Yeah, it gives different source, but the muscle produced by himself nitric oxide. In the skeletal muscle, you have two types, in principle, two types of nitric oxide synthesis. That means mainly the neuronal types, the type 1, and also the type 3, but possibly more in the mitochondrial area. But the skeletal muscles themselves produce NO. By side of them, the nitric oxide is also produced in the endothelial cells of the vessels. But there it had a specific role to regulate the vessels. But in the muscle, that's what I have shown, that mainly nitric oxide was directly produced in the skeletal muscle fibers.
Yes. So thank you very much for Professor Brock. So thank you very much again. So the next speaker, finally, Professor Yanis Pitsideris presented about integrated molecular behavioral environment aspect. Please.
Thank you. And I believe my talk ended 19 minutes ago. I apologize for keeping you, we're behind schedule, but I will try and make it as light and interesting for you to justify you staying over time. So first of all, I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers, especially my friend Jürgen Steinecker and Anna Heim for doing a wonderful job in putting this event together. I'm really grateful to being here. So I've been given actually quite a difficult task because I, as you can see here, have 3 areas. So I should have 3 times the amount of time, but I don't. But let's try and make it informative, and my talk is mainly directed at the coaches. I knew that there would be a lot of basic science in the session, so I thought I would bring it back together for the coaches to make it more useful to you. I hope the rest of you also find it interesting. So, let's begin. Okay. Not changing? Slide? Point to it? It's not doing anything. Oh.
Oh.
Thank you. Yes.
No.
Can I have my first slide, please?
Could you move it on?
while we're waiting for the first slide, what you will see from the first slide once it's ready is as we heard from the first talk, there's quite a mismatch between where the science is and actually what the public and the coaches hear. And the reason is that, unfortunately, the public, the coaches, don't always read the scientific literature. I'm not being facetious here, but they will hear and read about various public and popular textbooks, at least when it comes to genetics. And there have been a number of books written about the state of the art of genetic testing, and it appears to be very, very different to what actually is state of the art in terms of science. We heard from Bent Wolfhard earlier on that the genetic testing today has zero clinical utility. But why is it then that there are more and more companies around the world offering genetic testing to tell you, the coaches, how you should be identifying your talent, how you should be training your athletes? Why is there this mismatch? And hopefully I'll get my first slide now. Nope. Could you change to the first slide? I apologize for this. You could put my first slide for me too. Okay. So, my first slide, thank you. So, recapping slightly, because the order was a little bit off, okay, is that we've been asked in the session very much talk about the scientific basis of training and how the molecular biology, genetics, and so on can help us. And I referred to the mismatch between the messages we hear and where the state of the art is at the moment. And so what we're going to try and do today is, well, how can molecular biology, in the context of what we heard today, help us inform our coaching? The emphasis very much being on the scientific basis of coaching. Next slide, please. It's not working. Oops. Okay, my first slide. Thank you. So this is the popular books I referred to before, written, the first one here is written by Anders Ericsson, then another one by Malcolm Gladwell, a third one here, David Schenk, and the fourth one here by Matthew Syed, who I'm aware got it close to $1 million to actually write this book. But the end of the day, what their conclusion is, what their message is. I didn't press that. So now it's changing by itself. Okay. So their message is that anything is possible if you work at it. And that's the message from these books. That's why they've been endorsed with so much money to publish these books and why the message is such a popular one. But the reality is anything possible? Next slide. Okay, so these books, they are all based on this scientist, Anders Ericsson, who has written what some call the Bible of practice. You will have all heard of the 10,000-hour rule. And it was very much along these lines. And a quote from Anders Ericsson, "Practice is both necessary and sufficient for the attainment of deliberate performance, and is effective because it selectively activates dormant genes that are contained within all healthy individuals' DNA." Now, I'm not aware of anywhere where this actually happens. Next slide, please. So a few years ago, we were asked by the American College of Sports Medicine to put together a session on this 10,000-hour rule. As you can see here, the title was the genetic talent myth, the 10,000-hour rule. This is not working either. We invited all these experts, including Anders Ericsson, to present at this event. We heard early on from Bernd Wolfhard, as well the work of Claude Bouchard, who also came to this event. And the conclusion was, can I have my next slide, please? That genetic talent and the myth of the 10,000 hours rule, it actually changed around. The myth was not in terms of genetics, but it was more in terms of that anything is possible, you just need to have 10,000 hours practice. And that not everyone, it's not possible for everyone to achieve success. Next slide, please. So more recently, what we decided to do is actually, we'll try and get that message right. Let's put the message across as to what the literature is telling us. And you can see the title here of this more recent review, written by myself and a few of my colleagues, but also actually a double Olympian as well in Jamie Bolsh. And the title is Why Nature Prevails Over Nurture in the Making of the Elite Athlete. And that very much is going to summarize a lot of what I will say today, that not everything is possible, that we compete within a constraint, within a box, that we can't get much out further. Next slide, please. And so the conclusion from this was that truly elite level athletes are built, but only from those who are born with innate ability. And the experienced coach in this room will know that. You can do 10,000 hours work with some athletes that just won't get there. While others could get there with a much smaller amount of coaching and practice. Next slide. Next slide. So these kind of headlines, like this particular one from a very famous athlete and clothing and shoe apparel, impossible is nothing, is not really correct. Next slide. So we can reject that. Next slide. So this is really what goes on. And there's a nice paper here, a review written by Ross Tucker and Malcolm Collins from South Africa, who show you very nicely what happens in 6 individuals. And if you look, for example, at the 2 gray bars, they refer to 2 individuals with innate ability, but they reach different levels of success. You can see the one dotted line represents the current elite performance threshold, and the second dotted line is the current world record holder. So the person that you want to identify as a coach to work with is athlete A. But athlete A doesn't know it, that he could be a great athlete. So you could get athlete B, C, D, or E, or F in this example, because the circles indicate first encounter with the sport, and the white arrows indicate where they achieved when you got them as a coach. And you can see that really the athlete you want, the athlete with the world record at the moment is athlete C. You can see current world record holder, could potentially get to where the star is, but the best of all these athletes, athlete B, if you could train them, they could get further than actually and break the current world record. And you may have the misfortune to be given athlete F to coach, where you can see there's a limit as to where you're going to get that person. That is what I'm referring to, the limits that are dictated by how we choose our parents. Next slide. I can go over this quite quickly, but in this review we wrote, we also identified some of the key milestones that have happened in the new area of sports genetics. It's not an old area. And my friend Bernd Wilfrath summarized some of these, but starting off with the twin studies in 1971, then Claude Bouchard's study, and then you saw in 2001 the Human Genome Project, further the ENCODE project, Kathy North's Sprint gene, my work in 2007 identifying how there are no such thing as, there's no genetic superiority in African populations per se. Being black doesn't give you a genetic superiority per se. We did that in 2007. And then the 1,000 Genomes Project 2008, the Games Project in 2016 that we heard before from Bernd. And 2016, what we tried to do in response to the problem that Bernd mentioned is trying to get the groups to work together when there was very little money. So we set up this consortium called the Athlome Consortium. Next slide. And if you want to get scientists to interact when there isn't a lot of money to share their limited resources, what do? You invite them to the most exciting place in the world to talk science, Berlin, but also Santorini. Everyone attended. And we had some support from the International Sports Medicine Federation, and this idea of getting the scientists to work together was born. Next slide. And without going into details of all the things that we discussed, the first consensus from that discussion was, as Bernd mentioned, next slide, and you'll recognize that statement, that current genetic testing has zero predictive power on talent identification and should not be used by athletes, coaches, and parents, was the statement we all concluded. And you can see some very eminent and important partners took part in this meeting. Next slide. Oops. You went over the slide that actually shows that the next meeting of the AFLAM, there it is, was in Slovenia. And next slide, and I'll show you what was concluded there. We wrote another consensus, this time with the Australian Institute of Sport, as well as a statement that was actually co-signed as well by the International Sports Medicine Federation. You can see what we're trying to do. We're trying to correct that mismatch. Next slide. And you can see exactly the same conclusion. Next slide. Only a few months ago, the World Congress in Sports Medicine was held in Rio de Janeiro. Again, we had our next meeting of the AFLAM Consortium. Next slide. Again, the text is exactly the same. It's not changing. And so my point is, well, what do we need to do to change this? Next slide. So this would have been the first slide had we seen it. And it is really the approach that we need to use, which is we use a three-legged stool because each of those three, the molecular, the genetic component, the behavioral, the environmental one, all the factors that I'm going to talk about, are all equally important. A weakness in any of these pillars, you'll obviously collapse. So clearly in terms of genetics, currently the state of the art is what I've mentioned. So what can we do therefore to alter that? And I'll come back to that shortly. But can we use molecular approaches, some of which were alluded to by Dr. Bloch, but earlier on, to try and actually have useful information for the coach? Next slide. Because what the coach wants to know is not how cell signaling works within the muscle, or how many genes we have. They want to know, how do I choose my program? Keeping in mind, we're talking about the scientific basis of training. We're not talking about scientific of training based on your gut feeling. The scientific approach. Which way do you go? Next slide. And we've heard this early on today. This is the challenge. How do we go from a general group of athletes or general group of individuals who may not be even athletes to identify the different responders? Or to use Ross Tucker and Malcolm Collins' paper, how do you identify the one athlete that has the potential not only to break the world record, to smash the world record? Because with all the hard work in the world, you may not get there, because you may receive them when they're already well trained and they've got nowhere else really to go. Next slide. And so this is what you want. And for the physicians in the room, this is what you also want to do in the clinic. You want to do what is called personalized medicine. Next slide. Stratified medicine. Next slide. Or personalized prescription. This is what our challenge is. And it's a challenge for everyone in this room, whatever your background is, whether it's for coaching purposes or it's trying to find the best treatment for your patient if you're a physician. Next slide. So one way we all try and do this, and Jürgen's talk early on mentioned a lot about measurement and testing. And testing we've been doing for a long time. This is the Benedict lab in the 1900s, which used a lot of the approaches which we still use today. We even heard from early on today, the notion of lactate testing. Where did that come about? That came about from these two mentors of all of us, hopefully, who got Nobel Prize who got Nobel Prizes for discovering the role of lactate in A.V. Hill and also in the German Otto Meyerhof that you should all know. But the approaches they invented and got the Nobel Prize in 1922 is still what we heard from Jürgen Steneker today in terms of testing that we all still do. Where's the progress to help the coaches? We now know that some of that early work was a little bit wrong. Lactate or lactic acid doesn't cause fatigue, but it's an excellent way to actually, this point doesn't work, okay, but it's an excellent way to actually quantify the training. And we all now know the aerobic threshold, the lactate threshold, whatever you want to call it. It's a great measure of training intensity. But testing has been going on for a long time, and I managed to find this photograph from some years back now, where testing is going on. So we can do indoor testing. Well, we can also take it now further into the pool or into the rowing lake or area that you do. This is actually courtesy from James Pringle from the English Institute of Sport. This is one of our most decorated Olympian rowers that you may recognize shortly. Okay, we've improved it a little bit. We can now collect lactate when they're doing an exercise test from the earlobe, for example, and we can even do it just after they've done some hard rowing. This is certainly a move in the right direction. But what you really want is this. And how many of your athletes would you allow us to do this to? Sticking a needle into the femoral vein, the femoral artery, etc., 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 while they're doing a maximum test. You wouldn't allow us to do this, would you? But that's what you really need to get the information you need to become more scientific in determining who's going to respond to what training program. Incidentally, this is an Olympic athlete who was doing this test. But clearly it's not practical to do that. But can we get to this information? Because that's information we all want. And we can. This is the power of the central dogma of molecular biology. I'm not going to go through all this, but you heard of some of this today, and all of you should remember this from schooling anyway. The genome level, which is what can happen, the DNA level. The transcriptomics, which is what I'm going to talk about a little bit more, which is what appears to be happening, the RNA level. The proteome, not one protein, but the whole proteome. Not one metabolite, the whole metabolome. And then also measuring the phenotype, which you heard before is so important, which you understand better than anyone, and also using very powerful bioinformatics and supercomputers. You all have a supercomputer, you're holding it in your hand, your iPhone, if you have one. These can give us a lot of information that we can use. Why aren't we using it? The companies are ahead of us in some ways. I'm not picking on this company, but there's just one company that says, yeah, we are ahead of you scientists. We're already doing what you're saying. And they've even published they can do it. And you can see the bottom of this paper. And the conclusion here, which I try and read, is, our results indicate that matching the individual's genotype with the appropriate training modality leads to more effective resistance training. The developed algorithm may be used to guide individual resistance training interventions. Wow, that sounds great. It sounds even better when you hear Olympic athletes saying they've achieved success because of this. But you heard from Bengt before, we know very little. These companies are saying they're already doing it and selling. Is this right? One way we can write to the editor and say this should never be published. But how many coaches will read this? This will not be on the company's website. Now they have a published algorithm that works. And it gets even worse in some ways, because then you have examples during the World Cup, and I don't want to remind you about how Germany did, but don't worry, Greece wasn't even there. We have the example of companies saying that meet the former British Olympian using gene mapping to find the next Mo Salah. And they go on to say here how they are going to help the Egyptian team do well in the World Cup with their technology. Well, let's have a look. How did Egypt do? If you remember, they didn't win a game. That's besides the point. Again, we can reject this. But this is what is available out there for people to hear and read. And actually, this was a great success for this company, because within weeks of this, they were bought by one of the biggest Chinese companies called Alibaba for a large amount of money. Because this must work. It was in the newspapers. It must work. And then you get some more hype. Here, this article here, saying that the Chinese were going to select their winter athletes for the next Winter Olympics based on genetic testing. So we don't need coaches now. We have a method now. Can you see the point? Now, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but is this fake news or is this science? But what these companies are right is one thing, is that the technology has moved on from simple genetics that we heard from Brent, that he could do it himself in a few minutes, to much more complicated where you need infrastructure. And that is sequencing technology, DNA sequencing. You can see we'll be on a par with that of the microscope. It's going to be such an important tool. And actually the aim of my talk today is also to enthuse some of the young physicians in the room to take up this notion of genomics in the area of sports science and sports medicine, because we don't have many of them. They are a rare breed. So I'm going to use an example because, as also Ben said, we don't have a lot of money to actually do research in sports performance, because the coaches also don't want to interact with us because they think maybe there's not much here. But in the world of doping and in the anti-doping world, this may be the solution to deal with this crisis in sport that we're all aware of. So could we learn from the monies that are available from anti-doping to make these techniques powerful to eventually be used in sports science and sports medicine? Because we have an issue, and I'm sure here in Germany you'll know Perry's work very well, that showed very clearly, and you can see the conclusion here, that there's, again, this mismatch between the number of positives that are normally found, which are 1 or 2% adverse analytical findings, compared to 30% of athletes saying in the last year they had been doping in the World Championships, or 45% in the Pan-Arab Games. So you can see the current testing is not working. So can we try and improve that using this technology that can then be of use to the coach? In other words, can we apply a paradigm shift? Because typically in sport, the cheats are usually a step ahead. Can we change that? And with some funding from the IOC, we visited the American giant in sequencing called Illumina in August of this year. And they sequenced some of our samples from our clinical trials where we had given EPO to our athletes. I won't bore you with the details of this, you don't even know the details, but what we did is we took about 20 Kenyan individuals, Kenyan athletes training at altitude, and 20 Scottish athletes training at sea level, and we gave them EPO. We did tests before, during the EPO phase, and for the 4 weeks after. And we were trying to identify, can we identify those molecular signatures that can identify doping weeks after the last injections? Because the current test now, unless you test it on the day you take EPO, you're not going to be caught. And this is quite a messy slide, but I just want you to draw attention to the two boxes. The middle box, and I'm sorry I can't point it to you, the middle box is using some old array technology, like what Bengt used in the study where we showed no effect when we combined the 3,500 athletes. But if you look at those numbers carefully, the only number you need to note there is 950 genes. So 950 genes were identified weeks after the last injection of EPO. That is powerful, ladies and gentlemen. But then with Illumina technology, the one I just showed you, go to the box at the bottom, and you can see that number has gone to 2,250. Can someone cheat if 2,250 genes are being altered? That's powerful, I'm sure you'll agree. And then trying to get to the individual, here you see in red, you see the genes that are switching on during the EPO phase. They're going red because they're being upregulated. And then after EPO, they go green or blue because they're going downregulated. Imagine you're the coach and you're trying to identify if your program is fine, or if your athlete has been at altitude for long enough. This is exactly the same kind of information the 3 experts that evaluate the athlete biological passport need to do. That's also what the physician needs to look at to see the response of the patient to a particular intervention or drug treatment. This was an EPO experiment. But as already alluded to early on, the Chinese are spending more money wanting to do things bigger and bigger. And recently you would have seen the bridge from Macau to Hong Kong, that I don't think any other country in the world will put that amount of money to build. But they also made an announcement. The Chinese genome giant set its sights on the ultimate sequencer. Shouldn't we want access to this ultimate sequencer? Especially if we're going to try and improve our situation in the world of sport. So, I get on a flight and I travel to BGI. That's what the room full of sequencers looks like. This is what the computing cluster that runs these sequencers are using. Imagine we could use this in our clinics, in sport. Then we can make progress and not be in the situation Ben talked about. They also talked about the ultimate sequencer. I saw it. There it is. The problem was I couldn't fit it in my pocket to bring it back to the UK where my lab is based. So we're trying to find another way of getting access to that. Let me take you now to when with their support of the company, we analyzed the same samples, the doping samples, using this sequencer. I don't know if you can see the numbers there. I certainly can't, but I'll read it from here. We went from 2,200 to 3,300, even greater, another 1,000 genes. My point is, and the physicians in the audience actually all know this, depending on what tool you use, you'll get a different outcome. The sharper the tool, the better the outcome. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about anti-doping. I just want to show you how we've been using the wrong tools. That's why we've not been answering the questions. We need to use the better tools. And then we could be in a situation where we can help the coaches and so on. So coming back to the Athlone project, we have a number of different cohorts. And the one I'm going to just spend a few moments on is called the Gene Smart. Because the idea behind the Gene Smart was to train individuals using high-intensity training for 4 weeks, biopsy them, do blood tests, and actually try and identify any transcripts using whole genome transcriptomics that can be informative to the coach. That's what we try to do. And just very briefly, here's the design. I'm not going to dwell on it, but there was a pre-stage before the intervention, the post-stage, and we used an array. We hadn't at this point the funds to use the sequencing technology, but we used the next best here, which is those arrays, where you can see we can look at more than 285,000 transcripts, almost double what Bernd could and us, what we did a few years ago. And what did we find? Don't worry about the volcano plots at the bottom. The numbers here are important on top. Over 3,000 transcripts were differentially expressed immediately and actually 11,000 3 hours post high-intensity exercise. So a lot of things are going on, but you can't interpret this as easy as a lactate threshold because you have one parameter. You're looking at 3,655. So how can we analyze this? And here, by the way, are the changes that you get in VO2 max and peak performance and in muscle citrate synthase, which is an indicator of aerobic capacity within the muscle. And we want to link those thousands of genes to the change in phenotype, which in your case could be the improvement in performance that you see in your athlete. What are those genes that are telling me they're switching on because my athlete is really benefiting? Here comes the problem. We need access to supercomputers. We need access to powerful computers. But don't be afraid, they're coming. This BBC headline tells us quantum computers are going to be here very soon. The young people in the audience are going to be using quantum computers as frequently as we're using currently our normal computers. I remember as a PhD student not having access to a computer at all. This is going to become available. Imagine interpreting the data then that you're going to have access to. And it's going to be more complicated because we're going to have the whole omics cascade, not only transcriptomics, combining the genomics, the proteomics, the metabolomics. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we can then start talking about individualized prescription. The Russians attempted this some years ago. This is an Exos trial they did in 2012. They did an aerobic threshold test, but they were cleverer. Instead of measuring just the lactate threshold, they did an omics threshold. And so imagine being able to do that using sequencing, when you have all these different colors, red, blue, and ever, and they can tell you what's being switched on and what's being switched off. But the reality is today, we are not there yet. We can't do this. I'm afraid, coaches, you can't go away and use this today. Because if you compare this with the lactate threshold and the stopwatch, who wins? The stopwatch. Today. But not tomorrow. And I'm pretty sure I'm running out of time, but you've got to appreciate it's been quite a difficult presentation with my lack of visual aid, so bear with me if you may. So clearly that works better. But what can I give you to the coaches in the room? What can I give you so you can leave this room with something useful? Rather than hearing from Bernd, myself, actually there's nothing I can really use today. You know who he is. He's looking at his watch. Why is he looking at his watch? Can we learn something from here? And again, with some of you in the audience, Jürgen in particular, and also Dr. Block, we were in Medica a few days ago, and we did a demo, and we talked about one of this wearables technology. I'm wearing one of the smartwatches at the moment, and you can read the publication if you want, that can give you real-time information of what's happening to your athlete wherever the athlete is, because none of you in this room can run as fast as your athletes or can row as fast as your athletes. But you can get this in real time, and you heard from Jürgen before the difficulty of getting accurate data. Why don't we adopt the wearable revolution that's going on? You can use pills, you can develop different sensors, and I've got time to develop this. Here's a thermopole for measuring core temperature. You can do it remotely, in real time. Soon we'll have 5G as well. We've already done a demo a few weeks ago of a sensor you can put into the shoes or into different limbs and do real-time biomechanical analysis of your athlete in real time. This is not science fiction. This is not tomorrow. This can happen now. It's happening now. And what about having sensors better than just lactate? And here you can see, again, advertising wearables technologies next event in Munich in 2019. Please come. I know Jürgen and myself and others will be there, and Petra and so on. And can we measure things in real time different from sweat, from blood, from other tissues, in real time? And then we can start really getting to understand what makes our athletes so special. Is this science fiction? Well, watch this short video clip, which I doubt will work, but let's see. I told you it wouldn't work. Nope. Can I go back to that? Can I have that video clip, please, if possible?
Which one, Changing Life or the other one?
Changing Life. I'd rather be there at the moment, wouldn't you? But okay, the video clip that you should see is one that you can see. And some sound, please.
To track glucose levels without drawing a drop of blood, again and again.
When I was first diagnosed, you would definitely know I was diabetic by looking at my fingertips. Before the Freestyle Libre, I would have to stop to test my blood sugar. That would take up a lot of time. With this newer technology, you don't have to stop, and you don't have to wonder in that time, what is my body doing?
Drawing blood with painful finger sticks just to get the basic information they need about their glucose levels is unfortunately the reality for many people with diabetes. We really wanted to transform that reality, reinvent daily glucose monitoring, and provide a seamless and painless option. Here is the groundbreaking solution. Simply scanning this small sensor provides real-time glucose data.
I see the trend of my sugars, and I can prevent highs and lows in advance. I can do everything better with technology.
People are then able to adjust their diet, exercise, and insulin based on the results. And they're able to get healthier.
415 million people around the world have diabetes. Here at Abbott, we've been working to help people like Courtney live a better life. This technology is changing lives for people living with diabetes around the world.
Next slide, please. And the slide we should see, if it works, is our Prime Minister, who you love very much here in Germany, May. Next slide. Yeah, wearing one herself, okay? So this is, again, not science fiction. This is really already available. If we can measure glucose, why can't we do pyruvate, lactate, etc., when our athletes are training? Give you the information you need. Sport is an excellent model. So to conclude in terms of scientific basis of training, we mustn't ignore the past. We can learn from the past. But we need to adopt the new technologies and also very clever bioinformatics methods, and then we can really make progress. And also, let's also interact with the wearable revolution that's going on. It's going to change the coach's life. Please interact with this group. It's very, very important. And for the last 2 minutes, I'm not finished yet, you can't go. I didn't talk about the third leg, as I said to you, and if you left now, you wouldn't get the third leg, but only for a few minutes. So what are the kind of behavioral aspects that we should be talking about? And I don't have time to do the topic justice, but it's equally important. In other words, to the coaches in the room, why does this matter? Why does it matter what you, the coach, thinks? The best way to summarize this is I was going to show you this video clip, but it's unlikely to work, so let's just forget about the video clip. It is the 4-minute mile that Sir Roger Bannister ran, and to save time, and he actually talks about what he experienced on the day when he broke this. And I dedicate this also to Sir Roger Bannister, who passed away earlier on this year, but he did something incredible. He did something that the scientists, the physicians on the day didn't think was humanly possible. And this is what he did. He ran, as you can see, on the 6th of May, he ran 3 minutes 59.4. His main competitor, John Landy, a few weeks later, also ran under 4 minutes because he also then thought, well, if he can do it, I can do it. It is humanly possible. And then they raced together, and Sir Roger Bannister beat him in what a race was called the Mile of the Century. Belief is so very important. And to have a good support team. Coaches, you can't work in isolation. You have to work with a physician. You have to work with a physiologist. You have to work with as part of a team. Because Bannister achieved what he believed his coach believed he could achieve. And support team, by your actions, you contribute to the perceptions each athlete has of her or his ultimate performance potential. And this is the lovely quote from Sir Roger Bannister. The crucial thing that he, Stamford was his coach, said was, well, I think you can run a 3:56 mile. If he believed that, I hope he did, it certainly was a helpful comment. And he said, if you have the chance and you don't take it, you may regret it for the rest of your life. So the belief is very important. We have a role as sports medicine physicians, as scientists, to try and help you and influence your belief system. And with that, I apologize for the roller coaster presentation, and I thank you for staying and thank you for your attention.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Yanis. Now it's the floor is yours for discussion. Any question or comment? Welcome.
I think everyone's tired. Oh, there's a question there.
Here.
Thank you, Yanis, for your excellent presentation. I'm very you raise a number of very critical issues. I think for the audience, it's also important to clarify whether you actually think that all these advances that you are pointing out in genetics or so will be able to differentiate the winners within milliseconds and time in the 100 meters, or even in rowing, the last from the first. Maybe just there's 1 second difference between the last and the first.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you after all these years. I don't think that should be our quest, because we should also leave a little bit of spirituality into it as well that will make that difference. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to make sport about technology. You know, the technology and the approaches are meant to be used for the coaches, for example, to start using their art in some senses. But I do believe it will be used for you to be able to not waste your limited resources on athletes, some individuals that are not going to make it in that sport. It doesn't mean they couldn't make it in another sport, so this is not unethical, but they could be guided to what sport they could become very good at if that's what they want. Do I believe that it's going to be possible? Absolutely, certainly. So I feel that these technologies we should adopt irrespective of whether we can identify those milliseconds. Because if we could identify those milliseconds, then there's no point of doing sport. But thank you for that question.
Yes, any other question? Please, Van.
Yanis, thanks for the excellent talk. You were talking about the continuous glucose measurement. So what is your guess? What will be next in line? So this is not new. We use that since 6 to 8 years. I still used it in marathon runners in 2012, 2013. But since that time, not too much happened. Why don't we have a continuous lactate measurement now? I think it's money, so it's not so interesting for the companies to invest in that. But what is your personal guess? What will we get next? What we can use?
Thank you, and I'll pay you later for asking me this question because it's the exact question I wanted. I went over it very quickly, but you would have seen that the International Sports Medicine Federation, that I hope all the physicians in the room are members, have partnered with wearable technologies to actually set up this guiding reference to differentiate between what is actually useful and what is garbage. I'm afraid 99% of wearables are a gadget you get and you throw it away. It's no use to you, and that's not good for anyone. So we are working very closely with the wearable technology group to try and differentiate and help the industry produce wearables that really work, that also wearables that are what you also actually need. So the industry creates what they think is needed and wanted. So the role, and therefore putting money to it. I'll give an example. The sensor I showed you that we already can do real-time biomechanical analysis weighed 20 grams. But then a Swiss watch company wanted to put it into the watch. They paid $1 million and made it 0.2 grams. Now we have it. And in the next months, we'll probably be able to make it freely available because actually it's not expensive to make. It was just getting it to that size in the first term. To conclude, therefore, I think the industry will do what makes money, what is informative, so we need to interact. So my plea to you as coaches, because again, I am talking to the coaches as well, is that if we work together and find out what you need, if you need pyruvate, if you need whatever, and the scientist community need to work together, that's what we need, we can work together and develop that. That was my point, and I'll thank you for that. And I think that those technologies will become available, and will become available in real time. And sport is perfect because your athletes have to do this where it matters, not only in training, in competition. And by the way, that kind of technology I've showed you will be in show in the Olympics in Tokyo. So basically, there is that pathway there.
Okay, possibly a short comment to that. We work at the moment in a European community project, Horizon 2020, on such a lactate sensor, non-invasive, less invasive than the Abbott patch. And I think in 2 years we have it. And it costs around, it's estimated 15 to 20 euros per stick, and you can wear it for 14 days and then you take a new. And it gives also a new technology to measure glucose completely without invasive needles also. And we will start at the beginning of January to prove this method. So it's real, it's not future.
Exactly. And I go back to Ben's point though, what do you want the industry to be able to measure? And I can tell you what I want. I want to measure all those genes that are switching on and off. That's what I want. But we're certainly not there yet, but let's work towards that. But it comes back to what you want.
Please, Jenny.
Question over here.
I like very much your picture where we have three legs, we say, for high performance. But at the end, you are talking only about one leg. And you don't think that this leg is limiting too much the behavior point of view, in the sense that we block psychologically the athletes and the coaches only on one side of the, we say, physiological performance.
I'm sorry if I left that impression that I failed miserably in my presentation. That was not my point, because at the end of the day, remember, biology is also measuring our psychobiology. So when we look at 3,000 genes or 5,000 genes or 1,000 genes that are being switched on and off, when you actually look at what those genes do, you find that you get a picture of the whole body. So the idea is that what you, I don't know what your background, let's say you're a coach, what you see and you feel, can we give you the numbers, if anything, to validate what you already think you know? So it's not to say that the psychobiology is not important. Like yourself, probably myself, I've worked with a lot of very famous athletes. And in that group, at the point that was made early on, to differentiate them biologically is next to impossible. It's that psychobiological and that mystical entity that very few have. I don't think this biology kind of will ever get to that. So there will be room for all the other things. We are not going to make sport boring. It's the exact opposite. We want to clean up sport so the drugs are out, and we want to give you the tools so you can still break world records and make sport interesting within the rules. And psychology and psychobiology are going to be very, very important. And put that all together, belief is going to be the ultimate important. That's what makes the athletes great today. Performs well today, performs badly, then goes down because of lack of confidence. You can't measure that. But thank you. But so I'm agreeing while you can.
Was very famous one history about two athletes. There was one was identified as a talent, another one not talent.
Yes.
And then they discovered they made a mistake because they swapped the results. But in reality, we say you will be a champion. He went a champion, but was not his analysis.
Yeah, sure.
So this means that belief is more important of what you are really.
Yes, but if I may say, because that's where Matthew Syed got it wrong when he did his $1 million book that he wrote, because he misunderstood what I was saying, and maybe I confused people as well. You can't go beyond your limits, though. With all the willpower in the world, you can get closer to 100%. But you can't, and we're talking about endurance at this conference as well. Let's use a silly example from Bernd's research. If you took one of those controls that have VO2 max of 44, and you gave all the coaches in the world, all the drugs in the world, to make him run a 2-hour 10 marathon, I put down my mortgage, you will fail. Because they are limited within their biology. So within those constraints, you can't go further than that. So there will always be that mystical component, but we will eventually be limited by our biology. Thank you.
Yes, thanks again for Professor Yanis. Thank you very much.
And thank you for you.
And now it's time to conclude this session. Thank you very much for attending the session. So
I think everyone who has such a badge is entitled to have a lunch down in the restaurant. I don't know when it starts because I don't care about so much on nutrition, but it's down there. I think they start at 7, and so that was some of these coaches. Like Gianni said, we want a hardcore session. We don't want something easy. And we want to hear something about the future. And I'm very happy that we delivered something which was not easy, but it was really something which is relevant for the future. Thank you very much, and have a good evening, and see you tomorrow morning.
thank you very much for that presentation. That's really, it was so bad.
Das eine Wissenschaftler
So difficult. Yeah, difficult.
Stress für so Leute erkennt in dem Dunkeln und so. Also es geht, man geht irgendwie, kriegt man es irgendwie hin. Aber es ist